The void-going warships of the Imperium represent the single most critical instrument of Imperial power projection across the galaxy. Without these vessels, the Emperor's domains would fragment into isolated pockets of humanity, each world left vulnerable to the predations of xenos, heretics, and worse. The term Imperial Fleet encompasses far more than the warships of the Navis Imperialis alone. Three distinct naval powers operate under the aegis of the Imperium, each jealously guarding its independence while theoretically working toward the common goal of humanity's survival. These are the Navis Imperialis itself, the Basilican Astra of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the chapter fleets maintained by the Adeptus Astartes. Understanding the Imperial Fleet requires understanding that no single authority commands all three, and that coordination between them remains a constant source of friction, political maneuvering, and occasional outright conflict. The Navis Imperialis constitutes the largest of these three forces by orders of magnitude. Its warships patrol the space lanes, escort merchant convoys, suppress piracy, and form the backbone of Imperial military might during major campaigns. The Navy answers to the High Lords of Terra through a chain of command that begins with the Lord High Admiral of the Imperium, one of the 12 High Lords who sits in judgment over humanity's fate. Below this supreme commander, the Navy divides its strength according to the 5 segmentum fortress commands that partition the galaxy. Each segmentum maintains its own battle fleet, commanded by a Lord High Admiral of that segmentum, who wields near absolute authority over naval operations within their territory. Battlefleet Solar guards the Segmentum Solar and the approaches to Holy Terra itself. Battlefleet Obscurus maintains control over the northwestern reaches of the galaxy. Battlefleet Pacificus patrols the western fringe. Battlefleet Tempestus secures the turbulent southern regions. Battlefleet Ultima, the largest and most heavily reinforced of all battlefleets, faces the constant threat of Hive fleet incursions and the horrors emerging from the eastern fringe. Each battle fleet further subdivides into sector and subsector battle groups, creating a hierarchical structure that theoretically allows for rapid response to threats while maintaining centralized strategic control. In practice, the vast distances involved and the unreliable nature of warp travel mean that local commanders often operate with considerable autonomy. A sector Lord Admiral might not receive orders from their segmentum command for months or even years, forcing them to make strategic decisions that can affect billions of lives without higher approval. This necessary independence creates a Navy culture that values aggressive decision-making and personal initiative, though it also enables ambitious officers to pursue their own agendas with minimal oversight. The Basilican Astra operates according to entirely different principles. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains its own fleet of warships, ranging from explorator vessels pushing into unknown regions of space to heavily armed Arc Mechanicus ships that serve as mobile forge worlds. These vessels answer only to the Fabricator General of Mars and the ruling councils of individual forge worlds. The Mechanicus jealously guards its independence from the Navis Imperialis, citing the ancient Treaty of Mars that guaranteed the Mechanicus autonomy in exchange for supplying the Imperium with weapons and technology. Mechanicus warships bear different designations than Navy vessels, employ distinct tactical doctrines emphasizing overwhelming firepower over maneuverability, and crew their ships with tech priests, servitors, and scutarii rather than standard Imperial Navy personnel. The relationship between the Basilican Astra and Navis Imperialis remains cordial in theory but strained in practice, with both organizations competing for resources, shipyard access, and strategic priority. The chapter fleets of the Adeptus Astartes represent the third pillar of Imperial naval power. Each Space Marine chapter maintains its own fleet of strike cruisers, battle barges, and escort vessels necessary for deploying their warriors across the galaxy. These fleets answer to no authority save their own chapter masters. The Space Marines' independence from Imperial command structures stems from the reforms implemented after the Horus Heresy, when the legions were broken into smaller chapters, specifically to prevent any single commander from wielding the combined military might that allowed Horus to nearly destroy the Imperium. Chapter fleets typically number between a handful and several dozen warships, depending on the chapter's resources and strategic needs. Chapters like the Ultramarines maintain substantial fleets capable of independent operations across multiple star systems simultaneously, while other chapters possess only enough vessels to transport their warriors to war zones and provide orbital support. The command structure of each naval force reflects fundamentally different organizational philosophies. The Navis Imperialis maintains a rigid hierarchy based on seniority, political connections, and command competence, though not necessarily in that order. Officers progress through the ranks from ensign to lieutenant, commander, captain, and eventually admiral if they survive long enough and demonstrate sufficient skill or connections. Flag officers command flotillas, battle groups, and entire sector fleets, with Lord Admirals wielding authority over multiple sectors. Political considerations heavily influence promotion and assignment, with influential families maintaining naval dynasties that span millennia. The Adeptus Munitorum technically holds authority over naval logistics and supplies, creating a constant source of friction as Navy commanders resent civilian bureaucrats dictating operational readiness. The Basilican Astra operates through a theocratic meritocracy where technical knowledge and devotion to the machine god determine advancement. Ship commanders hold titles like Magos Dominus or Archmagos, reflecting their mastery of technology rather than purely military rank. Mechanicus vessels often blur the line between warship and research platform, with commanders pursuing technological recovery or investigation as primary objectives rather than purely military goals. This creates situations where Mechanicus ships refuse Navy requests for support because their commanders prioritize recovering archaeotech over tactical considerations that seem obvious to Navy officers. Space Marine chapter fleets answer solely to their chapter command, typically consisting of the chapter master, his captains, and the chapter's senior officers. Space Marine vessels serve as force projection platforms first and warships second. Their crews include chapter serfs drawn from the chapter's home world or recruiting worlds, individuals who consider service aboard a Space Marine vessel the highest honor achievable for those who cannot become Astartes themselves. Chapter fleet commanders coordinate directly with company captains to deliver their warriors exactly where needed, prioritizing speed and precision over the attritional warfare that characterizes much of Navy doctrine. The practical reality of coordinating these three distinct naval forces during major campaigns reveals the Imperium's organizational dysfunction at its most acute. When the Adeptus Munitorum declares a crusade or major military operation, it theoretically coordinates all Imperial military assets toward common objectives. The Navy receives orders to transport and support Imperial Guard regiments, establish orbital superiority, and blockade enemy-held systems. The Mechanicus receives requests for technical support, specialized weaponry, and assignment of Basilican Astra vessels to the campaign. Space Marine chapters receive pleas for assistance from the High Lords, planetary governors, or other Imperial authorities. Each organization then decides whether to commit forces based on its own priorities and political calculations. Navy commanders find themselves dependent on Mechanicus shipyards for repairs and maintenance, yet possess no authority to compel Mechanicus cooperation. A fabricator general might refuse to prioritize repairs for Navy vessels if doing so conflicts with Mechanicus strategic interests, leaving Navy commanders to negotiate, offer concessions, or simply wait while their ships sit damaged in dock. Similarly, Space Marine chapters commit forces to campaigns at their own discretion. A chapter master might deploy his warriors to a war zone because he judges the threat severe enough to warrant intervention, or he might refuse requests for assistance that seem politically motivated rather than genuinely necessary. Navy commanders possess no mechanism to compel Space Marine participation, though they can request aid through official channels that wind through layers of bureaucracy before reaching chapter leadership. Jurisdictional disputes erupt regularly during combined operations. When a Space Marine strike cruiser enters a system already under Navy blockade, questions of tactical authority immediately arise. Navy doctrine calls for centralized fleet command to coordinate all vessels in system, but Space Marine commanders rarely accept Navy authority over their ships. The Space Marines argue their vessels serve specialized purposes requiring independent operation, while Navy officers counter that uncoordinated actions jeopardize overall fleet cohesion. These disputes sometimes resolve through negotiation and mutual respect between commanders, but just as often devolve into parallel operations where Navy and Space Marine forces pursue separate objectives in the same theater. The Mechanicus adds another layer of complication. Basilic and Astra vessels operating in Navy-controlled space technically fall under local Navy authority for navigation and traffic control purposes, yet Mechanicus commanders frequently ignore Navy requests that conflict with their missions. A Mechanicus explorator vessel might refuse to join a Navy battle line because its commander prioritizes investigating an anomalous signal over tactical considerations. Navy officers lack any practical recourse beyond lodging formal complaints that disappear into administratum archives. The appointment of War Masters during major crusades attempts to impose unified command over these disparate forces. The High Lords of Terra occasionally grant a Lord Commander Militant or other Supreme Commander the title of War Master, investing them with authority to coordinate all Imperial military assets within a designated theater of operations. This authority theoretically extends to Navy, Mechanicus, and even Space Marine forces. In practice, War Master authority depends entirely on the individual's personal prestige, political connections, and ability to convince rather than compel cooperation. A War Master might successfully coordinate all Imperial forces if they possess sufficient respect and political capital, but a less capable or less connected War Master finds their orders ignored or undermined by subordinate commanders who maintain their own chains of command back to Terra or Mars. The political relationship between these organizations remains defined by mutual dependence and mutual distrust. The Navy requires Mechanicus shipyards, technology, and technical expertise to maintain its fleets. The Mechanicus depends on Navy protection for its forge worlds and trade routes. Both organizations benefit from Space Marine intervention during critical battles, while the Space Marines rely on Navy and Mechanicus support for supplies, transportation of auxiliary forces, and intelligence. Yet each organization guards its prerogatives jealously, viewing the others as potential rivals for resources and political influence rather than true allies. Lord High Admirals navigate this political minefield as part of their duties. They must maintain relationships with fabricator generals to ensure continued access to shipyards and supplies. They must coordinate with the Adeptus Munitorum despite resenting civilian oversight of military operations. They must request Space Marine assistance while knowing that chapters answer such requests at their discretion. They must compete with other Lord High Admirals for resources and prestige while theoretically cooperating to defend the Imperium. The most successful Lord High Admirals master both military strategy and political maneuvering, understanding that a battle won through superior logistics and alliance building proves just as decisive as one won through tactical brilliance. The Navis Imperialis as it exists in the 41st millennium bears little resemblance to the unified military force that conquered the galaxy during the Great Crusade. When the Emperor first launched his fleets from Terra, no distinction existed between the forces that fought in the void and those that waged war on planetary surfaces. The Imperial Army encompassed both void-going warships and ground forces under a single command structure, with fleet assets directly supporting army operations as integrated components of the same military machine. This arrangement allowed for devastating combined arms operations, where fleet commanders and ground force generals coordinated their efforts without bureaucratic barriers or jurisdictional disputes. The War Master Horus himself commanded both fleet and ground elements, wielding the full spectrum of Imperial military might as a unified instrument. The Horus heresy shattered this organizational model along with so much else. When the War Master turned traitor and nearly destroyed the Imperium, he did so by leveraging his control over both naval and ground forces simultaneously. Entire army regiments turned traitor alongside their supporting fleets, creating combined arms forces that proved devastatingly effective against loyalist resistance. The rebels coordinated void superiority with ground assaults in ways that demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of unified military command in the hands of a traitor. After the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne and the end of the heresy, Roboute Guilliman and the other surviving Primarchs instituted sweeping military reforms designed to prevent any future commander from wielding such concentrated power. The Imperial Army fractured into two separate organizations, the Astra Militarum, responsible for ground warfare, and the Navis Imperialis, responsible for void combat and fleet operations. This separation introduced deliberate inefficiency into Imperial military operations. No longer could a single commander coordinate fleet movements and ground operations with the seamless integration that characterized Great Crusade-era warfare. Instead, Navy and Guard commanders now operated through parallel chains of command that converged only at the highest levels of Imperial authority. A Lord General commanding Guard forces in a war zone possessed no authority over the Navy vessels providing orbital support, while the Lord Admiral commanding those vessels held no command over the Guard, regiments they transported and supported. Both organizations answered to different branches of the Administratum, received supplies through different logistical networks, and pursued career advancement through entirely separate hierarchies. The reforms succeeded in their primary objective of preventing another Horuscale rebellion, but they also ensured that Imperial military operations would forever after suffer from coordination problems, jurisdictional disputes, and bureaucratic friction. The post-heresy Navy developed void warfare doctrine that reflected this new organizational reality. Where Great Crusade fleets operated as direct extensions of ground campaigns, the Reformed Navy increasingly viewed void superiority as an end in itself, rather than merely a means to support planetary assault. Naval officers trained to think in terms of fleet versus fleet engagements, orbital blockades, and convoy protection, rather than the integrated operations that characterized earlier Imperial warfare. The Navy developed its own strategic priorities that sometimes aligned with Guard objectives and sometimes diverged entirely. A Navy commander might prioritize destroying an enemy fleet over providing orbital bombardment support for a Guard assault, reasoning that achieving void superiority served the broader strategic situation even if it left ground forces without immediate support. The classification of Imperial warships reflects both practical considerations and millennia of accumulated tradition. At the smallest scale, Navy carriers deploy wings of Fury interceptors and Starhawk bombers, small craft that lack warp capability and depend on carrier vessels for strategic mobility. These fighters and bombers serve critical roles in fleet engagements, screening larger vessels from enemy ordnance and striking at enemy ships with precision attacks that capital ship weapons cannot match. Navy doctrine calls for fighter screens to intercept incoming torpedo spreads and bomber wings to exploit breaches in enemy void shields, though the effectiveness of these small craft varies wildly depending on pilot quality and tactical circumstances. Escort vessels form the next tier of Navy strength. Frigates, destroyers, and corvettes serve as the workhorses of Imperial naval power, patrolling trade routes, hunting pirates, and providing screening elements for larger fleet formations. A Sword-class frigate stretches roughly 1.5 kilometers from prow to stern, mounting a single weapons battery and torpedo tubes along with the plasma drives and Geller field generators necessary for warp travel. Cobra-class destroyers sacrifice some armor and weaponry for increased speed, making them ideal for rapid response missions and hit-and-run attacks. Firestorm-class frigates mount lance weapons that can punch through enemy shields with focused energy beams. These escorts rarely operate individually, instead forming squadrons of 3 to 6 vessels that combine their firepower and coordinate their movements under the command of a squadron commander, holding the rank of captain or commander. Cruisers represent the backbone of Imperial naval strength. Light cruisers like the Dauntless-class measure 3 to 4 kilometers in length and mount weapons batteries on both port and starboard flanks, along with prow-mounted lances or torpedoes. A Dauntless can operate independently for extended periods, possessing sufficient firepower to destroy escort squadrons and enough armor to survive engagement with heavier vessels long enough to disengage. Standard cruisers like the Lunar class and Gothic class span 4 to 5 kilometers and mount significantly heavier armament. A Lunar class cruiser carries weapons batteries capable of reducing enemy escorts to wreckage with single broadsides, while its lance batteries strike at targets beyond conventional weapons range. Gothic class cruisers sacrifice some lance capability for additional torpedo tubes, allowing them to unleash devastating spreads of ship-killing ordnance. Heavy cruisers like the Overlord class push towards 6 kilometers in length and mount armament approaching that of smaller capital ships. Grand cruisers occupy an unusual position in Navy classification schemes. These vessels were built in large numbers during the Great Crusade, but fell out of favor in subsequent millennia due to their resource-intensive construction requirements. An Avenger-class Grand Cruiser measures 7 to 8 kilometers long and mounts firepower exceeding that of heavy cruisers, while maintaining the speed and maneuverability that capital ships sacrifice for raw power. The Navy maintains relatively few Grand Cruisers in active service, with most serving as flagships for sector admirals or forming the core of prestigious battle groups. Their rarity makes them valuable both as combat assets and as symbols of command authority. Battle cruisers blur the line between cruiser and battleship, combining heavy armament with speed that capital ships cannot match. The Mars-class battlecruiser stretches 8 kilometers from prow to stern and carries weapons batteries and lance arrays that can cripple enemy capital ships while maintaining enough speed to pursue fleeing opponents or disengage from unfavorable battles. Armageddon-class battlecruisers sacrifice some speed for even heavier firepower, making them effective ship killers in fleet engagements. Navy doctrine employs battlecruisers as fast response elements capable of reinforcing threatened sectors before enemy forces can consolidate their gains. Battleships represent the ultimate expression of Imperial naval power in routine service. An Emperor-class battleship measures 10 to 12 kilometers in length and masses several billion tons. Its armored hull can withstand punishment that would reduce lesser vessels to debris, while its weapons batteries can engage multiple targets simultaneously. The prow-mounted Nova cannon serves as the Emperor-class's signature weapon, capable of launching building-sized projectiles across vast distances to devastate enemy formations. Each battleship requires a crew of tens of thousands, from the command officers on the bridge to the gun crews manning weapons batteries to the engine room menials, who spend their entire lives maintaining the plasma reactors that power these massive vessels. The Navy maintains relatively few battleships compared to cruisers and escorts, with most sector fleets possessing only a handful of these capital ships. The rarest vessels in Imperial service include the Emperor-class battleships themselves, built in limited numbers during the 32nd millennium, when the Imperium still possessed the industrial capacity for such massive construction projects. Even rarer are the ancient Gloriana-class battleships, massive vessels built during the Great Crusade to serve as flagships for the Primarchs themselves. These ships measure 15 kilometers or more in length and mount armament that exceeds standard battleships by orders of magnitude. Only a handful of Gloriana-class vessels remain in Imperial service by the 41st millennium, with most having been destroyed during the heresy or lost in the millennia since. Those that survive serve as irreplaceable symbols of Imperial might, their loss representing not just tactical setbacks, but the permanent diminishment of the Imperium's naval strength. The Navy organizes these vessels into sector and subsector battle fleets that form the primary organizational structure for naval operations. A typical sector battle fleet includes 2 to 4 battleships or battlecruisers serving as flagships, a dozen or more cruisers of various classes, and several dozen escort squadrons. The exact composition varies based on the sector's strategic importance, threat level, and political influence. Sectors near major warp routes or critical forge worlds receive heavier fleet allocations than isolated sectors far from strategic objectives. A sector Lord Admiral commands this battle fleet from their flagship, typically a battleship or grand cruiser, coordinating patrol routes and responding to threats across dozens of star systems. Subsector battle fleets operate under sector command, but maintain considerable autonomy due to the vast distances involved. A subsector flotilla might include a cruiser squadron and several escort squadrons under the command of a commodore or junior admiral. These forces patrol their assigned regions, escort merchant convoys, suppress piracy, and respond to local emergencies without waiting for sector-level authorization. The subsector commander reports to their sector lord admiral, but may not communicate with higher command for months between reports, forcing them to make strategic decisions based on their own assessment of local conditions. The Navy maintains strategic reserves at major segmentum fortresses that serve as bases for the largest concentrations of Imperial naval power outside the Sol system itself. Battlefleet Gothic, based at the fortress world of Bacca in Segmentum Obscurus, guards the approaches to the Gothic sector and maintains one of the largest concentrations of capital ships in the Imperium. Its strength includes dozens of battleships and battlecruisers, along with hundreds of cruisers and escorts. Hydrafor in Segmentum Obscurus serves as another major naval fortress, its orbital shipyards capable of constructing and maintaining capital ships. Carduniash in Segmentum Ultima and Cipra Mundi in Segmentum Pacificus maintain similar strategic reserves, each fortress representing centuries of accumulated naval strength and infrastructure investment. These fortress fleets serve multiple purposes beyond simple defense. They provide strategic reserves that can reinforce threatened sectors during major campaigns, deploying battle groups to crisis zones across their segmentum. They maintain the shipyards and repair facilities necessary to keep the Navy operational, with orbital docks capable of servicing everything from escort vessels to battleships. They serve as training grounds where newly commissioned officers learn their craft and veteran crews practice fleet maneuvers. Most importantly, they represent concentrations of naval power sufficient to deter major enemy offensives, forcing hostile forces to account for potential reinforcement from fortress reserves before committing to major operations. Specialized fleet elements operate alongside standard battle fleets to fulfill specific strategic requirements. Explorator support squadrons accompany Adeptus Mechanicus expeditions into unknown regions, providing military escort for explorator vessels pushing beyond Imperial borders. These squadrons typically include cruisers and escort squadrons, commanded by officers who understand that their mission priorities differ from standard naval operations. The Mechanicus pays for these escorts through various arrangements with Navy Command, creating relationships where Navy officers find themselves serving Mechanicus objectives rather than purely Imperial ones. Blockade squadrons specialize in preventing enemy movement into or out of specific systems. A blockade squadron establishes patrol routes covering a system's major warp translation points, interdicting enemy vessels attempting to enter or leave the system. This requires different skills than fleet combat, emphasizing endurance and patrol coordination over the aggressive maneuvering that characterizes fleet engagements. Blockade duty tests crew discipline and morale, as vessels spend months or years maintaining patrol stations with minimal action, punctuated by brief, violent encounters with blockade runners. Reserve fleets maintain vessels in various states of readiness, from active reserve ships that can deploy within weeks to mothballed vessels requiring months of reactivation. The Navy maintains these reserves against future needs, though the condition of reserve vessels varies dramatically. Some reserve ships receive regular maintenance and could return to active service quickly. Others sit in orbital graveyards for centuries, their systems degraded beyond practical repair, but retained because the Navy refuses to officially acknowledge that these vessels will never sail again. The bureaucratic distinction between a ship in reserve and a ship that should be scrapped creates situations where Navy strength reports include vessels that exist only as corroded hulks. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains military forces that rival the Navis Imperialis in capability, if not in sheer numbers, operating under legal frameworks that predate the Imperium itself. The Treaty of Olympus Mons, signed during the Unification Wars when the Emperor first reached Mars, established the fundamental relationship between Terra and the Red Planet. This ancient compact guaranteed the Mechanicus complete autonomy over its internal affairs, control over all technology within the Imperium, and crucially, the right to maintain independent military forces. The treaty's provisions remain sacrosanct 10,000 years later, enforced not through mere tradition, but through the Imperium's absolute dependence on Mechanicus technology. Without the Forge world's weapons, ships, and equipment, the Imperial war machine would grind to a halt within years. This dependence ensures that the Mechanicus retains military forces answerable only to Mars, operating according to priorities that frequently diverge from broader Imperial strategic objectives. The Fabricator General of Mars holds supreme authority over all Mechanicus military assets, though in practice individual Forge worlds exercise considerable independence. Each major Forge world maintains its own fleet of warships, ranging from escort squadrons to capital ships that match or exceed Navy battleships in firepower. These vessels answer to the Forge world's ruling fabricator, who determines deployment priorities based on the Forge world's specific needs and strategic interests. A Forge world threatened by xenos raiders commits its fleet to local defense. Another Forge world pursuing technological recovery in distant regions deploys explorator fleets that might operate for decades beyond Imperial space. The Fabricator General can theoretically command all Mechanicus fleets to concentrate for major operations, but such unified deployments occur rarely, typically only when Mars itself faces direct threat, or when the Mechanicus collectively decides that a particular objective justifies the commitment of significant military resources. The Basilican Astra designation encompasses all Mechanicus void-going military vessels, from the smallest patrol craft to the massive Arc Mechanicus ships that serve as mobile Forge worlds. Unlike the Navis Imperialis, which maintains relatively standardized vessel classifications and organizational structures across all sectors, the Basilican Astra operates according to Forge world-specific doctrines that reflect each world's particular technological specializations and strategic priorities. A fleet from Ryza emphasizes plasma weaponry and aggressive tactics born from millennia of warfare against orcs. Vessels from Griffon 4, before that Forge world's destruction, specialized in graviton weapons and exotic defensive systems. Ships from Styges 8 incorporate stealth technologies and long-range auger arrays suited for reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. This diversity creates Mechanicus fleets that vary dramatically in composition and capability, depending on their Forge world of origin. Explorator fleets represent the Mechanicus's most visible military presence beyond Forge world space. These expeditions venture into uncharted regions of the galaxy, seeking lost standard template construct systems, archaeotech from the dark age of technology, and xenotech that might yield insights into advanced technological principles. An explorator fleet typically includes at least one Arc Mechanicus as its flagship, supported by cruiser-weight vessels configured for long-range operation and numerous escort craft. The fleet carries thousands of tech priests, servitors, and skitarii, along with the supplies necessary for years or decades of independent operation. Explorator Magos command these expeditions with objectives that extend far beyond simple exploration. They seek specific technological artifacts based on fragmentary records recovered from ancient data cores, investigate anomalous signals that might indicate functioning Dark Age installations, and map regions of space that Imperial charts mark as unknown or forbidden. The quest for standard template construct systems drives much explorator activity. These ancient databases contain complete manufacturing instructions for Dark Age technology, representing the pinnacle of human achievement before Old Night shattered galactic civilization. A complete SDC system could revolutionize Imperial technology, providing construction templates for everything from basic agricultural equipment to advanced weapons systems. The Mechanicus has recovered only fragments of SDC databases over the millennia, individual templates for specific devices rather than complete systems. Each discovery, no matter how minor, justifies the resources committed to explorator expeditions. A template for an improved pattern of lasgun represents a significant find. A template for a lost vehicle design or defensive system becomes cause for celebration across multiple Forge worlds. The theoretical discovery of a complete, intact STC system would rank among the most significant events in Imperial history, potentially altering the balance of power throughout the galaxy. Famous explorator expeditions have pushed into regions where even the Navis Imperialis fears to venture. The explorator Fleet Sigma Rho spent 40 years mapping systems beyond the halo stars at the galaxy's edge, recovering archaeotech from human colonies that fell during Old Night and never reconnected with the Imperium. The expedition lost half its vessels to unknown threats and hostile xenos, but the survivors returned with technological artifacts that justified the losses in Mechanicus calculations. Explorator Fleet Delphi 9 investigated the Ghoul Stars, a region notorious for vessels that enter and never return. The fleet vanished completely, its fate unknown, though the Mechanicus continues to classify it as on extended deployment rather than acknowledging its probable destruction. Other explorator fleets operate in the halo reaches beyond Ultramar, in the veiled region where warp storms make navigation nearly impossible, and in the gaps between spiral arms where ancient human colonies might still exist in isolation. The dangers facing explorator fleets extend beyond mere navigation hazards. Regions beyond Imperial space harbor xeno civilizations that view human intrusion as cause for immediate violent response. Explorator vessels encounter Orc empires, Eldar maiden worlds, Tau expansion fleets, and worse. Many expeditions discover that the archaeotech they seek lies within Xenos held territory, forcing difficult decisions about whether technological recovery justifies the military risks of assault against entrenched alien defenses. The Mechanicus accepts these losses as necessary costs of technological progress, reasoning that the potential benefits of recovered technology outweigh the destruction of individual expeditions. This calculation appalls Navy officers who view Mechanicus' willingness to sacrifice entire fleets for uncertain technological gains as borderline heretical. But the Mechanicus answers only to Mars and the machine god, not to Navy sensibilities about acceptable casualty rates. Arc Mechanicus vessels represent the ultimate expression of Mechanicus naval power and technological capability. These ships dwarf even the largest Navy battleships, measuring 15 to 20 kilometers in length and massing tens of billions of tons. An Arc Mechanicus serves simultaneously as warship, forge complex, research facility, and repository for irreplaceable Dark Age technology. The construction of a single Arc Mechanicus requires centuries of effort and resources that would build dozens of Navy capital ships. Many Arc Mechanicus vessels date from the Great Crusade or earlier, their hulls incorporating technologies that the Mechanicus no longer fully understands, but maintains through ritual and accumulated practical knowledge. The oldest arcs incorporate systems from the Dark Age itself, making them mobile museums of lost technological achievement as much as functional warships. The Speranza serves as perhaps the most famous Arc Mechanicus still in service during the 41st millennium. This vessel participated in the Horus Heresy and survived 10,000 years of continuous operation, its data cores containing technological information spanning human history from the Dark Age through the present. The Speranza measures nearly 20 kilometers long, its hull mounting weapons batteries that can reduce enemy capital ships to scrap, and more exotic armaments, including chrono weapons that manipulate time itself around their targets. The vessel's machine spirit possesses near-sentient awareness, communicating with its tech priest crew through data streams and manifesting what some observers describe as distinct personality traits. Other notable Arc Mechanicus vessels include the Omnissiah's Victory, flagship of Explorator Fleet Designate 32, and the Adamant Ciborium, which guards the approaches to Mars itself as part of the Forge world's defensive fleet. Arc Mechanicus vessels serve strategic purposes that extend beyond their immediate military capabilities. Each arc carries forge complexes capable of manufacturing everything from small arms to void ship components, making them self-sufficient for extended deployments. The forges can also support other Mechanicus vessels and even Navy ships if political considerations warrant such assistance. And Ark's research facilities house tech priests pursuing investigations into recovered archaeotech, xenotech, and theoretical technological principles. These facilities include testing chambers where dangerous or unstable technologies can be examined under controlled conditions, though controlled remains a relative term when dealing with poorly understood Dark Age systems. The data cores aboard an Ark Mechanicus contain backups of critical technological information from the vessel's forge world of origin, ensuring that even if the forge world itself suffers catastrophic damage, the knowledge it accumulated over millennia survives aboard its arks. The strategic importance of Ark Mechanicus vessels means the Mechanicus deploys them cautiously, committing these irreplaceable assets only when objectives justify the risk. An Ark might lead an explorator fleet into unknown regions, serving as mobile base for decades-long expeditions. Another Ark might remain in orbit around its forge world, serving as orbital fortress and emergency manufacturing facility. During major campaigns, the Mechanicus sometimes commits arcs to provide mobile forge support for Imperial forces, though such deployments require extensive negotiation between Mechanicus and Navy command. The loss of an Ark Mechanicus represents a catastrophe for the Mechanicus, not merely because of the vessel's military value, but because of the irreplaceable technology and knowledge it carries. When the Ark Mechanicus Omnipotence fell to Chaos forces during the Gothic War, the Mechanicus committed substantial military resources to recovering the wreck, specifically to prevent its technology from being turned against the Imperium. Mechanicus warship designs reflect fundamentally different priorities than Navy vessels. Where Navy doctrine emphasizes balanced armament mixing lance weapons, macro cannon batteries, and torpedo tubes, Mechanicus vessels favor lance weaponry almost exclusively. Lance batteries fire focused energy beams that punch through void shields and armor with precision that macro cannon shells cannot match. A Mechanicus cruiser typically mounts multiple lance arrays along its flanks and dorsal surfaces, creating overlapping fields of fire that can engage multiple targets simultaneously. This emphasis on lance weaponry reflects both technological preference and tactical doctrine. The Mechanicus values precision over volume of fire, preferring weapons that strike with certainty rather than saturating target zones with shells that might miss. Lance weapons also require less ammunition storage than conventional batteries, freeing internal volume for forge facilities and research laboratories. Advanced auger arrays distinguish Mechanicus vessels from their Navy counterparts as clearly as their weapons loadouts. A Mechanicus warship carries sensor systems that exceed Navy vessels by orders of magnitude, capable of detecting enemy ships at extreme range and analyzing target composition with precision that Navy augers cannot approach. These auger arrays serve multiple purposes beyond simple navigation and targeting. They scan for technological artifacts, analyze stellar phenomena, detect warp anomalies, and gather intelligence on enemy capabilities. A Mechanicus vessel entering a system begins comprehensive auger sweeps immediately, cataloging every technological signature and analyzing data for potential items of interest. This auger superiority gives Mechanicus fleets significant tactical advantages, allowing them to detect ambushes before Navy vessels, register threats, and identify enemy vessel classes at ranges where Navy augers show only undifferentiated contacts. The crews aboard Mechanicus vessels differ as dramatically from Navy personnel as the ships themselves differ in design. Where Navy vessels crew with tens of thousands of baseline humans, Mechanicus ships operate with far smaller crews of tech priests and servitors. A Mechanicus cruiser might require only hundreds of tech priests to maintain and operate systems that would need thousands of Navy crew to manage. Servitors handle most routine operations, their cybernetic augmentation allowing them to interface directly with ship systems and execute commands with mechanical precision. Tech priests oversee these servitors while maintaining the rituals necessary to appease the vessel's machine spirit and keep ancient systems functioning. The bridge of a Mechanicus vessel resembles a cathedral to the machine god more than a navy command deck, with tech priests chanting binary cant while monitoring data streams through direct neural interface rather than reading physical displays. Skitarii regiments provide military force aboard Mechanicus vessels, serving roles analogous to Navy armsmen, but with capabilities that exceed baseline human soldiers. These cybernetically enhanced warriors carry advanced weapons including radium carbines, arc rifles, and plasma calivers. Their augmented reflexes and targeting systems make them devastatingly effective in boarding actions or when defending against enemy boarding parties. A Skitarii cohort can repel boarding attempts that would overwhelm Navy armsmen through sheer firepower and coordination, enabled by their cybernetic augmentations. Larger Mechanicus vessels carry entire Skitarii legions, thousands of warriors organized into cohorts and maniples under the command of Skitarii marshals who coordinate their forces through Noospheric battle cant. Tech Guard regiments supplement Skitarii forces aboard major Mechanicus vessels and Forge worlds. These soldiers receive less extensive augmentation than Skitarii, but still exceed standard Imperial Guard in equipment and training. Tech Guard units specialize in defending forge complexes and technology repositories, their training emphasizing protection of critical systems over offensive operations. A Tech Guard regiment deployed from a Mechanicus vessel brings heavy weapons including las cannons, plasma cannons, and Volkite culverins that Imperial Guard forces rarely access. Their officers coordinate with tech priests to ensure that defensive operations account for technological assets that must be protected at all costs. Unique vessel classes serve in Mechanicus fleets that have no Navy equivalents. The Dictator-class cruiser mounts extensive launch bays for attack craft, carrying fighter and bomber wings that rival dedicated Navy carriers despite the Dictator's cruiser displacement. These vessels serve as fleet scouts and strike platforms, their attack craft probing enemy formations and exploiting tactical opportunities. The Tyrant-class cruiser emphasizes lance armament to an extreme degree, mounting battery after battery of lance weapons along its flanks and spine. A Tyrant class can engage multiple targets simultaneously with lance fire, making it devastatingly effective in fleet actions, where its firepower can be brought to bear against enemy capital ships. The Lunar-class cruiser serves in both Navy and Mechanicus fleets, though Mechanicus variants mount additional auger arrays and substitute lance batteries for some macro cannon turrets. The relationship between Basilic and Astra vessels and Navy ships during combined operations remains complicated by jurisdictional questions and divergent priorities. A Mechanicus fleet operating in Navy-controlled space technically falls under local Navy authority for navigation purposes, but Mechanicus commanders routinely ignore Navy instructions that conflict with their missions. When a Navy admiral requests Mechanicus support for a fleet action, the Mechanicus commander evaluates the request based on whether participation serves Mechanicus interests rather than feeling obligated to support Imperial military operations. This creates situations where Mechanicus vessels refuse to engage enemy forces that Navy doctrine would consider priority targets, instead pursuing technological objectives that seem incomprehensible to Navy officers. A Mechanicus cruiser might break formation during a fleet engagement to investigate an anomalous signal, leaving Navy vessels without expected support because the Mechanicus commander prioritizes potential archaeotech recovery over tactical coordination. The Mechanicus justifies this independence through the Treaty of Olympus Mons and its monopoly on technology. Navy commanders who protest Mechanicus' refusal to follow orders find themselves reminded that their fleets depend entirely on Mechanicus shipyards for maintenance and repair. A Forge world can deny Navy vessels access to its repair facilities, leaving damaged ships unable to return to service. This leverage ensures that Navy complaints about Mechanicus independence rarely escalate beyond formal protests that both sides understand carry no practical consequences. The Mechanicus operates its fleets according to its own strategic calculus, Cooperating with Navy forces when doing so serves Mechanicus interests and ignoring Navy requests otherwise. The Space Marines maintain void-going capabilities that operate under entirely different constraints than either the Navis Imperialis or the Basilican Astra, where the Navy fields thousands of vessels across hundreds of sectors, and the Mechanicus deploys fleets according to Forge World priorities. Each Space Marine chapter operates a small fleet optimized for a single purpose, delivering the Emperor's finest warriors to battlefields across the galaxy with overwhelming speed and precision. These fleets answer to no authority beyond their chapter masters, maintain operational independence that even the High Lords of Terra cannot override, and pursue strategic objectives determined solely by chapter leadership. The legal framework supporting this independence stems from the same post-heresy reforms that separated the Imperial Army into distinct Navy and Guard organizations. When Robute Guilliman authored the Codex Astartes in the aftermath of the heresy, he established not just the organizational structure of Space Marine chapters, but also the limitations on their military assets designed to prevent any single chapter from wielding the overwhelming power that the traitor legions had turned against the Imperium. The Codex Astartes specifies that a standard Codex-compliant chapter should maintain approximately 2 to 3 strike cruisers and 6 to 8 rapid strike vessels as its primary void-going assets. This allocation provides sufficient naval strength for a chapter to deploy its companies independently across multiple war zones, while preventing any single chapter from accumulating the fleet resources necessary to pose a strategic threat to Imperial stability. A chapter with 1,000 battle brothers organized into 10 companies can deploy multiple company strength forces simultaneously using this fleet allocation, with each strike cruiser capable of transporting and supporting a full company of Space Marines along with their vehicles and equipment. The rapid strike vessels serve as escorts and independent deployment platforms for smaller strike forces, typically carrying between 50 and 100 Space Marines along with their support elements. This Codex limitation reflects hard lessons learned during the heresy. The Space Marine legions that turned traitor commanded fleets numbering hundreds of vessels, including multiple capital ships, numerous cruiser-weight warships, and vast flotillas of escorts. When these legions rebelled, they brought their fleets with them, creating naval forces that could challenge loyalist fleets on equal terms while simultaneously deploying tens of thousands of traitor Marines. The Codex restrictions ensure that no chapter possesses sufficient fleet strength to threaten vital Imperial systems or conduct sustained independent campaigns without support from other Imperial forces. A chapter fleet can raid enemy territory, conduct lightning strikes against priority targets, and deploy companies to active war zones, but it cannot sustain prolonged void warfare against a determined enemy with significant naval assets. The practical implementation of these restrictions varies considerably across different chapters. Codex-compliant chapters like the Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, and their successor chapters generally adhere to the specified fleet allocations, though even these chapters sometimes maintain additional vessels through various justifications. A chapter might argue that training vessels, system defense monitors, or specialized ships serving unique purposes fall outside Codex limitations. Other chapters interpret the guidelines more loosely, maintaining fleets that exceed Codex specifications while technically remaining within acceptable parameters. The distinction between a vessel, classified as a strike cruiser versus one designated as a battle barge, sometimes depends more on chapter record keeping than actual capability differences. Notable exceptions to Codex fleet limitations exist among chapters that either predate the Codex Astartes or explicitly reject its organizational principles. The Black Templars maintain crusade fleets that dwarf the naval assets of Codex-compliant chapters, with multiple battle barges and dozens of strike cruisers distributed among their various crusades scattered across the galaxy. The Black Templars justify this by arguing that their chapter operates as multiple independent crusading forces rather than a single unified chapter, though this explanation satisfies legal requirements more than it reflects actual organizational reality. Each Black Templars crusade operates semi-independently under a marshal, who commands between 100 and 300 battle brothers, along with supporting fleet elements. The chapter as a whole maintains no central fortress monastery, instead operating from their fleets as they pursue their eternal crusade against the Emperor's enemies. The Space Wolves similarly maintain fleet strength exceeding Codex specifications, with each of their great companies operating independently under a Wolf Lord who commands his own vessels. The Space Wolves never fully adopted the Codex Astartes after the heresy, maintaining organizational structures that hew closer to their Legion-era traditions than to Guilliman's reforms. Their great companies vary in size from roughly 100 to 200 Space Wolves, each supported by strike cruisers and escorts sufficient for independent operation. The chapter maintains multiple battle barges, including their Fortress Monastery Fang's orbital defense fleet, creating a combined naval strength that approaches or exceeds small Navy battle groups. The Space Wolves justify this through their status as a first founding chapter and their role defending the approaches to the Eye of Terror, though the underlying reality remains that few Imperial authorities possess the capability or willingness to enforce Codex compliance against a first founding chapter that chooses to ignore it. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters maintain fleet assets dedicated to their secret hunt for the fallen, those members of their legion who turned traitor during the heresy. These vessels operate independently of the chapter's standard fleet allocation, crewed by chapter serfs who understand that certain missions require absolute secrecy. When the Dark Angels receive intelligence suggesting the presence of one of the fallen, they deploy specialized strike forces aboard vessels that officially do not exist in chapter records, pursuing their quarry without regard for other Imperial priorities. This parallel fleet structure allows the Dark Angels to maintain their hunt across the galaxy while simultaneously fulfilling their official duties as a Space Marine chapter, though it requires careful record-keeping to prevent outside observers from questioning why the chapter possesses more vessels than Codex guidelines specify. Strike cruisers form the backbone of Space Marine naval power across nearly all chapters. These vessels measure roughly 5 to 6 kilometers in length, significantly smaller than Navy cruisers, but purpose-built for the specific requirements of Space Marine operations. A strike cruiser combines the functions of warship, transport, and mobile fortress in a single package, optimized for rapid deployment and orbital assault. The vessel carries between 100 and 300 Space Marines depending on mission requirements, along with their power armor, weapons, vehicles, and supporting equipment. Thunderhawk gunships fill the strike cruiser's launch bays, ready to deploy at a moment's notice to deliver Space Marines directly to planetary surfaces or to enemy vessels. Drop pod launch tubes line the strike cruiser's ventral hull, each tube containing a single drop pod capable of carrying 10 fully armored Space Marines through orbital insertion directly into combat zones. The dual role of strike cruisers as both warships and deployment platforms drives their design characteristics. Unlike Navy cruisers that optimize for ship-to-ship combat, strike cruisers prioritize bombardment capabilities and defensive systems over pure offensive firepower. A strike cruiser's weapons batteries focus on providing orbital fire support for ground operations, rather than engaging enemy capital ships in extended void combat. The bombardment cannons mounted along a strike cruiser's flanks can reduce enemy fortifications to rubble from orbit, their shells guided by Space Marine spotters on the ground to strike with precision that Navy orbital bombardment rarely achieves. Lance batteries provide the strike cruiser with anti-ship capability sufficient to engage enemy escorts and defend against larger vessels long enough to complete deployment operations and disengage. The armor protecting a strike cruiser reflects Space Marine priorities of survivability over speed. These vessels sacrifice the maneuverability that Navy cruisers prize in exchange for armored hulls that can withstand tremendous punishment while remaining combat effective. A strike cruiser pushes through enemy fire to reach orbital insertion positions, its armor absorbing hits that would cripple Navy vessels of similar displacement. Void shields layered over this physical armor provide additional protection, though strike cruisers typically mount fewer shield generators than comparable Navy vessels due to power requirements for bombardment systems and launch bay operations. The combination of heavy armor and adequate shielding makes strike cruisers remarkably difficult to destroy, allowing them to operate in hostile orbital environments where Navy vessels would require fleet support. Comparing strike cruisers to Navy cruisers reveals fundamental differences in design philosophy and operational doctrine. A Navy cruiser like the Lunar class measures slightly larger than a strike cruiser and mounts heavier broadside armament optimized for fleet engagements. The Lunar class carries weapons batteries and lance arrays designed to engage enemy capital ships at range, trading sustained firepower for the Navy's preferred tactics of long-range gunnery duels. A strike cruiser engaging a Navy cruiser in conventional void combat would find itself outgunned, as the Navy vessel brings more weapons to bear and maintains better firing solutions through superior maneuverability. However, Space Marine doctrine never calls for strike cruisers to engage in sustained ship-to-ship combat. Instead, strike cruisers close rapidly with enemy vessels, weathering incoming fire through heavy armor while launching boarding parties via Thunderhawk and boarding torpedo. Once Space Marines breach an enemy vessel's hull, the engagement shifts from void combat to close quarters battle, where the Emperor's finest warriors hold overwhelming advantage. The crews aboard strike cruisers consist entirely of chapter serfs, who consider their service the highest honor achievable for those who cannot become Space Marines themselves. These serfs come from the chapter's recruiting worlds or from families who have served the chapter for generations, their loyalty to the chapter absolute, and their training specialized for Space Marine vessel operations. A strike cruiser operates with a crew of several thousand serfs who maintain the vessel systems, crew its weapons batteries, and handle routine operations under the supervision of a handful of Space Marines who serve as the vessel's command staff. The ship's captain holds the rank of Space Marine captain or a senior officer detached from company command to lead the vessel. These commanders understand both void warfare and ground operations, coordinating their vessels to support chapter operations rather than pursuing independent naval objectives. Battle barges represent the ultimate expression of Space Marine naval power, serving as chapter flagships and mobile fortresses capable of deploying entire companies directly into the most hostile environments. These vessels dwarf strike cruisers, measuring 8 to 10 kilometers in length and massing several times more than their smaller counterparts. A battle barge can carry between 300 and 500 Space Marines, along with their full complement of vehicles, equipment, and supporting elements. The vessel's launch bays accommodate dozens of Thunderhawk gunships, land speeders, and other aircraft, while its drop pod capacity exceeds that of multiple strike cruisers combined. Chapters typically maintain only 1 or 2 battle barges, with these vessels serving as flagships for the chapter master or senior captains commanding major deployments. The massive assault capacity of battle barges makes them ideal for planetary invasions and void station assaults where Space Marine forces must deploy in overwhelming strength. A battle barge approaching a hostile world can launch simultaneous drop pod assaults, Thunderhawk insertions, and boarding torpedo attacks that deliver hundreds of Space Marines directly into combat within minutes. The vessel's bombardment capabilities exceed those of strike cruisers by significant margins, with bombardment cannons capable of cracking open hive cities and reducing fortress complexes to molten slag. When the Imperial Fists deploy their battle barge Alcazar Remembered, entire planetary defense forces surrender rather than face the orbital bombardment that the vessel brings to bear. The Black Templar's battle barge Eternal Crusader serves not just as flagship, but as the chapter's mobile fortress monastery, carrying the chapter's most sacred relics and serving as the primary base for the High Marshal. Boarding capabilities distinguish battle barges even more than their assault capacity. These vessels mount specialized boarding systems that allow them to engage enemy capital ships directly, clamping onto hostile vessels with docking claws and breaching their hulls with melta-cutters before deploying Space Marine boarding parties directly into enemy ships. A battle barge can engage enemy vessels that would destroy strike cruisers through sheer firepower, using its heavy armor and powerful void shields to close to boarding range while weathering incoming fire that would reduce lesser vessels to debris. Once the battle barge establishes boarding contact, Space Marine Terminators and veteran assault squads pour into the enemy vessel, fighting through its corridors to reach critical systems and command decks. Enemy crews face the nightmare of Space Marines rampaging through their ship, killing anyone who resists and sabotaging vital systems. Many enemy commanders scuttle their vessels rather than face capture by Space Marine boarding parties, though this merely accomplishes the Space Marines' objective of removing the enemy ship from the battle. Ancient patterns of battle barges maintained by first founding chapters incorporate technologies that the Imperium can no longer replicate. The Blood Angel's battle barge Blade of Vengeance dates from the Great Crusade, its hull incorporating systems that modern tech priests maintain through ritual and accumulated knowledge rather than true understanding. The vessel's machine spirit possesses characteristics that suggest near sentient awareness, responding to its crew's needs with initiative that exceeds standard vessel programming. The Dark Angel's battle barge Invincible Reason served as flagship for Lionel Johnson during the Great Crusade, its weapon systems including Dark Age technology that the chapter's Tech Marines carefully maintain. These ancient vessels represent irreplaceable assets, their loss diminishing not just the chapter's military capability, but the Imperium's connection to its past. Rapid strike vessels serve as the workhorses of chapter fleets, operating as escorts for larger vessels and as independent platforms for small strike forces. These ships vary considerably in classification and capability, from Gladius-class frigates measuring roughly 1.5 kilometers to Hunter-class destroyers and Nova-class frigates. A rapid strike vessel typically carries between 50 and 100 Space Marines, along with a handful of vehicles, and a reduced Thunderhawk complement. These vessels excel at rapid deployment missions, where a full company deployment would be excessive, but where significant Space Marine presence is required. A squad or two of Space Marines deployed from a rapid strike vessel can eliminate enemy leadership, destroy critical infrastructure, or conduct reconnaissance that shapes subsequent larger operations. The speed and maneuverability of rapid strike vessels exceed that of strike cruisers and battle barges, allowing them to operate independently across vast regions of space. A chapter might deploy rapid strike vessels to patrol its recruiting worlds, respond to distress calls from Imperial authorities, or hunt enemy raiders operating in the chapter's territory. These vessels also serve as scouts for larger chapter fleet operations, pushing ahead of strike cruisers to gather intelligence on enemy dispositions and identify priority targets. During fleet engagements, rapid strike vessels screen larger chapter vessels from enemy escorts and torpedo attacks, their weapons batteries eliminating threats before they can close with the chapter's capital ships. Thunderhawk gunships represent the primary tactical deployment platform for Space Marines conducting planetary assault operations. These heavily armored attack craft measure roughly 20 meters in length and can carry a full squad of 10 Space Marines along with their equipment directly from orbit to planetary surface. A Thunderhawk's armament includes heavy bolters, las cannons, and battle cannons that provide fire support during insertion and extraction operations. The craft's armor withstands ground fire that would destroy conventional aircraft, allowing Thunderhawks to operate in contested airspace where Navy aircraft would require fighter escort. Space Marine pilots fly these craft with skill enhanced by their superhuman reflexes and decades of experience, conducting combat insertions into landing zones under heavy fire and extracting squads from combat zones with precision that regular human pilots could not match. Boarding torpedoes provide Space Marines with specialized equipment for void warfare focused on close assault rather than conventional ship-to-ship combat. These massive projectiles measure 10 to 15 meters in length and carry between 5 and 10 Space Marines in armored compartments. The torpedo launches from specialized tubes, accelerating toward enemy vessels at speeds that make interception difficult. Upon impact, the boarding torpedo's melta-cutters breach the enemy hull, creating an entry point through which the Space Marines deploy directly into the enemy vessel. The initial breach often occurs in critical areas like engineering spaces or command decks, with Space Marines emerging into shocked enemy crews who have seconds to respond before the Emperor's warriors begin their assault. Boarding torpedo attacks prove devastatingly effective against enemy capital ships, as even a handful of Space Marines loose inside a vessel can cause catastrophic damage to vital systems. Drop pods represent the ultimate expression of Space Marine planetary assault doctrine. These single-use deployment vehicles launch from orbit, their heat shields protecting the 10 Space Marines inside during atmospheric entry. Retro rockets fire in the final seconds before impact, slowing the drop pod just enough that its passengers survive the landing. The drop pod sides blow outward upon landing, allowing the Space Marines to deploy immediately into combat. A company-strength drop pod assault delivers 100 Space Marines directly into combat within minutes of launch, their pods landing in coordinated patterns that allow squads to support each other while establishing control over key terrain. Enemy forces facing a drop pod assault must deal with Space Marines appearing in their midst without warning, the shock of sudden assault by superhuman warriors often breaking enemy morale before conventional resistance can organize. The Space Marine approach to void warfare prioritizes boarding actions and planetary assault over conventional ship-to-ship combat in ways that Navy officers find difficult to understand. A Navy commander views void combat as a contest of firepower, maneuver, and endurance, where victory goes to the fleet that concentrates superior force against enemy weaknesses. Space Marines view void combat as merely the preliminary phase before the real battle begins. A chapter fleet engaging enemy vessels seeks to close to boarding range as rapidly as possible, using its vessel's heavy armor to survive the approach before launching boarding parties that transform the engagement from void combat to close quarters battle. This doctrine reflects both Space Marine capabilities and limitations. Space Marines excel at close combat, where their superhuman abilities and superior equipment provide overwhelming advantage. They possess limited naval assets compared to dedicated fleet forces, making extended void warfare campaigns impractical for most chapters. When Space Marine fleets coordinate with Navy forces during major campaigns, these doctrinal differences create both opportunities and friction. Navy commanders appreciate Space Marine ability to eliminate enemy capital ships through boarding actions, as a single squad of Space Marines loose inside an enemy battleship can achieve what might require hours of sustained bombardment to accomplish through conventional means. However, Navy officers find Space Marine willingness to close with enemy vessels reckless, as the approach to boarding range exposes Space Marine vessels to concentrated enemy fire. From the Space Marine perspective, accepting damage during the approach represents acceptable cost for achieving boarding contact, as their vessel's heavy armor allows them to survive punishment that would destroy Navy ships. The Navy's preference for long-range gunnery duels seems wasteful to Space Marines, who view extended void combat as squandering time and resources that could be better spent delivering warriors to where they can engage the enemy directly. The independence of chapter fleets from Navy command creates coordination challenges during combined operations. A Space Marine strike cruiser operating in a system under Navy blockade technically falls under local Navy authority for navigation and traffic control, but Space Marine commanders rarely accept Navy tactical direction. When a Navy admiral requests Space Marine support for a fleet engagement, the Space Marine commander evaluates the request based on whether participation serves the chapter's objectives rather than feeling obligated to support Navy operations. This creates situations where Space Marine vessels refuse to join Navy battle lines, instead pursuing independent objectives that Navy commanders consider tactically unsound. A strike cruiser might break away from a fleet engagement to conduct a boarding assault on an enemy flagship, leaving Navy vessels without expected support but potentially eliminating enemy command and control in ways that conventional void combat could not achieve. The void-going assets of the Imperium extend far beyond the battle fleets of the Navy, the forged ships of Mars, and the strike cruisers of the Adeptus Astartes. Countless other vessels ply the space lanes under various authorities, each serving specialized functions that prove essential to Imperial operations, despite their lack of prominence in official military hierarchies. These specialist and auxiliary fleets operate under different legal frameworks, answer to different masters, and pursue objectives that sometimes align with broader Imperial strategy and sometimes diverge entirely. Understanding the full scope of Imperial naval power requires examining these supporting elements that enable the Imperium to function across 1,000,000 worlds. The Inquisition maintains its own naval assets separate from all other Imperial military forces, operating under authority granted directly by the Emperor himself through the ancient charter that established the Inquisition during the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. Inquisitors possess the legal right to requisition any Imperial vessel for their purposes, from Navy battleships to merchant freighters, though exercising this authority requires political capital and often creates friction with the vessel's original commanders. Beyond these requisitioned ships, the Inquisition operates dedicated vessels crewed by personnel answerable only to the Ordos. These ships range from small courier craft that transport individual Inquisitors and their retinues to capital ships mounting armament that rivals Navy cruisers. The black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica represent the most visible component of inquisitorial naval power. These vessels conduct the soul binding, the great tithe of psychers that every world must pay to sustain the Astronomican and provide the Imperium with sanctioned psychers. The League of Black Ships maintains a fleet of specialized vessels designed specifically for transporting psychers from collection points across the Imperium back to Terra. These ships incorporate extensive psychic shielding and suppression systems necessary to prevent the untrained psychers in their holds from manifesting their powers during transit. A single psycher losing control aboard a vessel traveling through the warp could doom everyone aboard, making the Black Ship's containment systems as critical as their engines or gellar fields. The holds of a Black Ship contain thousands of individual cells, each designed to hold a single psycher in isolation from their fellows. Null Maidens of the Sisters of Silence serve as guards and handlers, their psychic blankness suppressing the powers of nearby psychers through their mere presence. These pariahs move through the holds without fear of psychic attack, their anti-psychic aura causing physical discomfort to the psychers they guard, but ensuring that no psychic manifestation can threaten the vessel. The conditions aboard Black Ships during transit remain deliberately harsh, as the Imperium prioritizes security over the comfort of individuals who might at any moment transform into gates through which demons could pour into real space. Many psychers die during the journey to Terra, their bodies disposed of through airlocks, while the survivors continue toward their fate. The journey of a Black Ship follows routes that connect collection points across multiple sectors, each stop adding more psychers to the holds, until the vessel carries its full complement of 10,000 or more souls. The ships travel in convoys escorted by Navy frigates, assigned to protect these critical vessels from pirate attack or worse. The loss of a Black Ship represents not just the destruction of a valuable vessel, but the waste of thousands of psychers whose powers could have served the Imperium. Enemy forces understand this, making Black Ships priority targets when encountered. Chaos warbands hunt these vessels specifically, seeking to corrupt the psychers aboard and turn them into weapons against the Imperium. Drukhari raiders prize psychers as particularly valuable slaves, making Black Ships targets for their hit-and-run attacks. Upon reaching Terra, Black Ships dock at the orbital facilities surrounding the Imperial Palace, where their cargoes undergo processing by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The strongest psychers face the soul binding, a ritual that links their souls to the Emperor and allows them to serve as astropaths transmitting messages across the Imperium. Those who survive the ritual emerge changed, their eyes burned from their sockets by the psychic connection, but their powers now sanctioned and controlled. Weaker psychers serve other purposes, from staffing the Scholastica Psychona to providing psychic support for various Imperial institutions. The weakest and those judged too dangerous for any useful purpose face a different fate, their souls fed to the Emperor to sustain his psychic presence and keep the Astronomican burning. The Black Ships then depart Terra to begin the cycle again, an endless circuit that has continued for 10,000 years. Beyond the black ships, individual inquisitors maintain personal vessels suited to their specific needs and methods. An inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos might operate a fast courier equipped with extensive auger arrays for tracking alien movements across multiple systems. These vessels sacrifice armament for speed and sensor capability, relying on stealth and maneuverability rather than firepower to survive encounters with hostile forces. The auger systems aboard such ships exceed even Mechanica standards in some cases, incorporating xenotech that the Inquisitor recovered during previous investigations and adapted for Imperial use despite the technical heresy this represents. Other Inquisitors maintain armed cruisers capable of independent military operations, vessels that can deploy entire companies of stormtroopers or eliminate orbital defenses without Navy support. The Ordo Xenos operates specialized hunter-killer squadrons dedicated to tracking and eliminating specific Xenos threats. These squadrons typically consist of several frigates or destroyers commanded by an Inquisitor or their designated representative, crewed by personnel trained specifically for anti-Xenos operations. A squadron hunting Orc pirates might include vessels equipped with heavy prow armament for ramming attacks, recognizing that Orcs respect brute force and direct assault over sophisticated tactics. Another squadron pursuing Eldar raiders operates vessels mounting advanced auger systems and high-speed engines, understanding that catching Eldar ships requires matching their speed and anticipating their movements rather than attempting to outfight them in conventional void combat. The deployment of these hunter-killer squadrons reflects inquisitorial priorities rather than broader Imperial strategic concerns. An Inquisitor who identifies a specific Xenos threat can assemble a squadron and pursue that threat across multiple sectors without requiring approval from Navy Command or other Imperial authorities. This independence allows the Ordo Xenos to respond rapidly to emerging threats, but it also means that valuable military assets operate outside the normal command structure. Navy admirals resent Inquisitors who requisition escort squadrons for anti-Xenos operations, removing those vessels from patrol routes or fleet deployments that the Navy considers more pressing. The Inquisitors counter that their authority supersedes Navy priorities, creating conflicts that typically resolve in the Inquisition's favor due to their ultimate authority over all Imperial institutions. The Ordo Hereticus maintains execution forces designed specifically for eliminating heretical Imperial officials, rogue psychers, and other internal threats to Imperial stability. These forces operate from armed transports and cruisers that can deploy stormtrooper companies directly into hostile environments. The vessels mount extensive communications arrays that allow Inquisitors to monitor Vox traffic across entire systems, searching for evidence of heresy or corruption. When an Inquisitor identifies a target requiring military force to eliminate, their vessel can deploy execution teams via Valkyrie dropship or boarding torpedo, depending on whether the target occupies a planetary surface or void station. The crews of these vessels include specialists in various forms of warfare, from urban combat experts who can clear Hive city blocks to void warfare specialists who excel at boarding actions against defended stations. The Ordo Malleus maintains perhaps the most heavily armed inquisitorial vessels, as their mission of combating demonic incursions requires firepower and defenses beyond what other Ordos typically need. A Malleus Inquisitor's ship incorporates extensive psychic shielding, hexagrammic wards inscribed across every bulkhead, and weapons blessed specifically for use against demonic entities. These vessels carry Grey Knights when available, the Space Marine chapter dedicated to fighting demonic threats, providing military force that can confront entities that would corrupt or destroy normal human soldiers. The holds of a Malleus vessel include containment facilities for captured demonic artifacts, each item sealed within multiple layers of psychic and physical barriers to prevent corruption from spreading through the ship. Chartist vessels form the backbone of inter-system commerce throughout the Imperium, operating under charters granted by planetary governors, sector authorities, or in rare cases the Administratum itself. These merchant ships lack the armament of military vessels, but prove essential to imperial logistics, transporting raw materials, finished goods, and personnel between systems according to established trade routes. A typical Chartist vessel measures several kilometers in length. Its holds capable of carrying millions of tons of cargo. The vessel's crew numbers in the thousands, from the ship's master who holds the charter to the hold workers who load and unload cargo at each port of call. These crews often include families who have served aboard the same vessel for generations, their entire lives spent traveling between the same handful of systems, according to routes established centuries or millennia ago. The charter system that governs merchant shipping reflects the Imperium's need to control commerce while acknowledging the practical impossibility of direct administratum management of every trade route. A charter grants its holder the legal right to transport goods between specific systems, typically along routes that serve imperial strategic interests, by connecting forge worlds with sources of raw materials or moving finished goods from manufacturing centers to markets. The charter holder pays taxes and tithes to imperial authorities in exchange for this monopoly, creating revenue streams that fund imperial operations while ensuring that critical supply chains remain functional. Some charters date back thousands of years, passed down through merchant families who have operated the same routes since the age of apostasy or earlier. The practical operation of Chartist vessels requires navigating both the physical dangers of warp travel and the bureaucratic complexities of imperial commerce. Each system a Chartist vessel visits imposes docking fees, inspection requirements, and cargo taxes that the vessel's master must pay before conducting trade. The administratum maintains records of approved cargoes and destinations, theoretically preventing merchants from transporting forbidden goods or conducting unauthorized trade. In practice, the vast scale of imperial commerce and the corruption endemic to imperial bureaucracy means that smuggling and black market trade flourish despite official prohibitions. A Chartist captain willing to pay bribes can transport nearly anything to nearly anywhere, though the risks of discovery include confiscation of cargo, revocation of charter, and execution for particularly serious violations. The military importance of Chartist vessels extends beyond their official commercial role. During major imperial campaigns, the Adeptus Munitorum requisitions merchant vessels to transport guard regiments, move supplies to forward bases, and evacuate wounded from combat zones. A Chartist vessel pressed into military service loses its commercial cargo capacity for the duration of its requisition, creating financial losses for the charter holder that the administratum theoretically compensates, but in practice often ignores. Merchant captains resent these requisitions, which expose their vessels to combat damage and disrupt established trade routes, but refusing munitorum demands invites charges of treason. The result creates a merchant fleet that serves military purposes when required while maintaining the commercial operations essential to imperial economic function. The defenses aboard Chartist vessels reflect their status as civilian ships operating in a dangerous galaxy. Most merchant vessels mount defensive weapons batteries sufficient to deter pirate attacks, typically macro cannons or laser batteries positioned to cover the vessel's vulnerable flanks. These weapons cannot match military-grade armament in firepower or accuracy, but they provide enough deterrence that small pirate bands typically seek easier targets. Larger merchant vessels sometimes mount lance weapons or torpedo tubes, particularly those operating routes through regions known for heavy pirate activity. The crews manning these weapons receive minimal training compared to Navy gun crews, making merchant vessels poor combatants in any sustained engagement despite their armament. Void shields protect the most valuable merchant vessels, though most Chartist ships rely primarily on armored hulls to survive the occasional hit from pirates or debris strikes. The expense of maintaining void shield generators makes them impractical for most commercial operations, where profit margins depend on minimizing operational costs. Merchant captains accept the risk of operating without shields, reasoning that their vessel's commercial nature makes them less attractive targets than military ships carrying valuable military cargo. This calculation proves correct often enough to justify the risk, though merchant vessels operating in particularly dangerous regions sometimes band together in convoys that share the protection of a handful of armed escorts hired specifically for that purpose. Rogue traders occupy a unique position within imperial society, operating under warrants of trade that grant them authority exceeding that of planetary governors in some respects. These ancient documents, issued by the High Lords of Terra, or in some cases by the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade, authorized their holders to travel beyond imperial borders, conduct trade with xenos species, and maintain private military forces including substantial void-going fleets. A rogue trader dynasty might operate for thousands of years, the warrant passing from one generation to the next, along with the dynasty's accumulated wealth and fleet assets. The most powerful rogue trader, dynasties control commercial empires spanning multiple sectors, their fleets numbering dozens of vessels, including capital ships that rival Navy battleships in capability. The legal authority granted by a warrant of trade supersedes normal imperial law in many circumstances. A rogue trader can negotiate with xenos civilizations without facing charges of heresy, explore regions of space forbidden to other imperial subjects, and conduct military operations without coordinating with Navy or Guard Command. This independence makes rogue traders valuable to the Imperium, as they push into regions where conventional imperial forces cannot or will not venture. The Imperium benefits from rogue trader exploration through the new trade routes they establish, the resources they discover, and the intelligence they gather about threats beyond imperial borders. In exchange, rogue traders accumulate wealth that would make planetary governors envious, operating beyond imperial taxation and regulation, while enjoying legal protections that shield them from most consequences of their actions. The fleets maintained by major rogue trader dynasties rival those of Space Marine chapters in capability, if not in tactical doctrine. A successful rogue trader might operate a flagship measuring 8 to 10 kilometers in length, mounting weapons batteries and lance arrays that match Navy cruisers, while incorporating luxury accommodations befitting the rogue trader's status. These flagships serve as mobile bases from which the rogue trader conducts their operations, carrying thousands of crew members, soldiers, and specialists necessary for the dynasty's various enterprises. Supporting vessels include armed merchantmen for transporting cargo, escort frigates for protecting trade convoys, and specialized ships suited to particular missions like exploration or intelligence gathering. The von Valantius dynasty operates from the cruiser-weight vessel that serves as both warship and mobile palace, its holds containing treasures recovered from dozens of worlds beyond imperial space. The Korda dynasty maintains a fleet that includes multiple capital ships, accumulated over millennia of successful trading and occasional piracy against xenos vessels. House Balakian operates a fleet specializing in exploration, their vessels mounting auger arrays and cartographic equipment that exceed even Mechanica standards in some applications. These dynasties pass their fleets down through generations, each new rogue trader inheriting vessels that might date back centuries or even millennia, maintained through wealth accumulated by their ancestors. The military capabilities of rogue trader vessels vary dramatically based on the dynasty's focus and resources. Some rogue traders operate what amount to private navies, their vessels armed and armored to military standards and crewed by experienced void warfare specialists. These rogue traders conduct operations that blur the line between legitimate commerce and outright piracy, attacking xenos vessels and claiming their cargoes as legitimate salvage under their warrants. Other rogue traders maintain fleets optimized for trade rather than combat, their vessels mounting minimal armament while maximizing cargo capacity and operational range. These merchants rely on their warrants' legal protections and their reputations rather than military force to conduct their business, though even peaceful rogue traders typically maintain enough military capability to defend against pirates and minor xenos threats. The relationship between rogue traders and other imperial institutions remains complicated by the traders' unique legal status. Navy admirals resent rogue traders who operate capital ships without submitting to Navy authority, viewing these private fleets as potential threats to imperial security. the administratum struggles to tax rogue trader operations that occur beyond imperial borders, creating resentment over the vast wealth that traders accumulate while paying minimal tithes. The Inquisition monitors rogue traders closely, recognizing that their authority to deal with xenos and explore forbidden regions creates opportunities for corruption. Some inquisitors maintain relationships with specific rogue trader dynasties, using them as assets for investigations that require operating beyond normal imperial jurisdiction. Other inquisitors view all rogue traders as potential heretics whose dealings with xenos inevitably lead to corruption. The Adeptus Ministorum maintains its own fleet of temple ships, missionary vessels, and cathedral ships that spread the imperial creed across the galaxy. These vessels operate under authority granted by the ecclesiarch and funded through the vast wealth that the Ministorum accumulates through tithes and donations. A temple ship serves as mobile shrine and missionary base, carrying preachers and lay clergy to worlds where the imperial creed requires reinforcement, or where newly discovered human populations need instruction in proper worship of the God Emperor. The vessel's interior resembles a cathedral more than a starship, with vast worship halls capable of accommodating thousands of faithful, shrines containing relics of imperial saints, and living quarters for the clergy who staff the mission. Cathedral ships represent the most impressive examples of Ministorum naval power, measuring several kilometers in length and incorporating architectural elements that make them immediately recognizable as religious vessels. The hull of a cathedral ship might feature massive statuary depicting the emperor or imperial saints, their forms visible from orbit around any world the vessel visits. Stained glass viewports show scenes from imperial religious history, their colors visible when internal lighting illuminates them. The vessel's spires and towers extend from the hull like those of groundside cathedrals, each topped with symbols of imperial faith. These architectural features serve no practical purpose for void travel, but prove essential for the cathedral ship's mission of inspiring faith among populations who witness their arrival. The armament aboard Ministorum vessels reflects the ecclesiarchy's official prohibition against maintaining men under arms, a restriction imposed after the Age of Apostasy, when the ecclesiarch Goj Vander nearly destroyed the Imperium through his control of both religious and military power. Ministorum vessels technically mount only defensive weapons, typically macro cannon batteries and lance weapons positioned to protect against pirate attack. In practice, the distinction between defensive and offensive armament proves difficult to maintain when a cathedral ship's weapons batteries match those of navy cruisers in firepower. The ecclesiarchy argues that these weapons serve purely defensive purposes, protecting the faithful and the Ministorum's sacred mission from heretical attack. Navy commanders note that a cathedral ship's broadside can reduce enemy vessels to wreckage just as effectively as any Navy cruiser, making the defensive designation somewhat academic. The Order's militant of the Adepta Sororitas maintain limited naval assets supporting their military operations across the Imperium. The Sisters of Battle technically fall under ecclesiarchal authority, providing the Ministorum with military force while technically complying with the prohibition against men under arms through the simple expedient that the Sororitas consist entirely of women. The Orders operate transport vessels and armed cruisers that deploy their forces to war zones and provide orbital support during ground operations. These vessels incorporate the same religious architectural elements as other Ministorum ships, their hulls decorated with symbols of imperial faith and their interiors featuring shrines and chapels where the sisters conduct their devotions. A typical Sororitas vessel serves as both warship and mobile convent, carrying several hundred battle sisters along with their vehicles, weapons, and supporting personnel. The vessel's chapel serves as the spiritual heart of the ship, where the sisters gather for daily prayers and receive blessings before deploying to combat. The armory contains the specialized weapons that the Orders employ, from blessed bolters to meltaguns and flamers used to purge the Emperor's enemies. The medical bay includes facilities for treating wounded sisters and maintaining the faith of those who survive injuries that would kill normal humans. The command deck operates under the authority of a canoness or senior sister superior, who coordinates the vessel's movements with ground operations and ensures that the Order's forces deploy where the Ecclesiarchy's interests require their presence. The limited size of Sororita's fleets reflects both the Order's relatively small size compared to other Imperial military forces and their focus on ground combat over void warfare. Each Order militant typically operates between 2 and 6 vessels, sufficient to transport their forces and provide orbital support, but not enough to conduct independent fleet operations. During major campaigns, Sororita's vessels coordinate with Navy fleets and other Imperial forces, their specialized capabilities complementing conventional military assets. A Sororita's cruiser's bombardment systems include specialized munitions blessed by ecclesiarchal authorities, their shells carrying not just explosive force, but spiritual power that proves particularly effective against demonic entities and chaos corruption. The missionary fleets that the Ministorum deploys to bring the Imperial Creed to newly discovered human populations or reinforce faith on backsliding worlds operate under different constraints than military vessels. These fleets prioritize transport capacity and endurance over armament, their vessels designed for extended deployments to remote regions where Imperial authority remains weak or absent. A missionary fleet might include a cathedral ship serving as flagship, several transport vessels carrying supplies and personnel, and a handful of armed escorts for protection against pirates. The fleet travels to its destination, establishes missionary compounds on the target world, and remains in system for years or decades, while the missionaries work to convert or reinforce the local population's faith. The success of missionary operations depends heavily on the resources and persistence that the Ministorum commits to each mission. A world that has drifted from proper Imperial worship might require only a single temple ship and a few dozen preachers to restore correct faith. A world that has never known the Imperial Creed requires more extensive operations, with missionaries establishing cathedrals, training local clergy, and systematically converting the population over generations. The missionary fleet provides support for these operations, its vessels serving as bases where missionaries can rest between their work on the surface and as refuges if local populations turn hostile. The engagement protocols followed by Imperial naval forces reflect millennia of accumulated experience fighting enemies, ranging from orc pirate fleets to chaos armadas that emerged from the Eye of Terror. Navy doctrine divides void combat into distinct phases, each requiring different tactical approaches and emphasizing different weapon systems. The opening phase of any major fleet engagement begins at extreme range, often hundreds of thousands of kilometers, where auger arrays first detect enemy vessels and commanders begin maneuvering their formations for advantage. At these distances, only specialized long-range weapons can engage effectively, making the Nova cannon the weapon of choice for fleet commanders seeking to establish early dominance. A Nova cannon mounted in a battleship's prow can launch projectiles the size of hab blocks across vast distances, their shells traveling at significant fractions of light speed toward target coordinates calculated by the vessel's targeting cogitators. The shells themselves carry no guidance systems, making them essentially ballistic weapons that rely on precise firing solutions and the target's inability to maneuver rapidly enough to avoid incoming fire. A Nova cannon shell that strikes an enemy capital ship delivers kinetic energy sufficient to crack the vessel's spine, rupture its plasma reactors, or simply punch through multiple decks to emerge from the opposite side after devastating everything in its path. The psychological impact of Nova cannon bombardment often exceeds even its physical effectiveness, as enemy crews watch building-sized projectiles streak toward their vessels knowing that their void shields provide minimal protection against such massive kinetic impacts. The tactical employment of Nova cannons requires careful coordination between the firing vessel's captain, gunnery officers, and auger teams who track enemy movements and calculate firing solutions. The weapon's massive power requirements mean that firing drains significant energy from the vessel's plasma reactors, temporarily reducing power available for shields, engines, and other weapon systems. Most battleships can fire their Nova cannons once every several minutes at most, making each shot a calculated decision that commanders must weigh against other tactical priorities. Fleet doctrine calls for concentrating nova cannon fire from multiple vessels against priority targets, typically enemy flagships or capital ships whose destruction would disrupt enemy command and control. A coordinated salvo from 3 or 4 battleships can saturate a target zone with enough firepower that even if most shells miss, the ones that connect prove devastating. The effectiveness of nova cannon bombardment decreases as range is close and enemy vessels begin evasive maneuvers that make targeting solutions less reliable. As fleets close to range is measured in tens of thousands of kilometers rather than hundreds of thousands, engagement transitions to the lance battery phase where focused energy weapons become the primary armament. Lance weapons fire coherent beams of energy that travel at light speed, making them effectively impossible to dodge once fired. The beams punch through void shields through sustained focused energy rather than overwhelming them with kinetic impact, making lances particularly effective against heavily shielded targets that might shrug off macro cannon shells. A lance battery consists of multiple individual lance weapons mounted along a vessel's flanks or dorsal surfaces, their firing coordinated to strike the same target zone simultaneously and overwhelm local shield coverage. Navy tactical doctrine emphasizes lance exchanges at what officers term medium range, typically 30 to 50,000 kilometers, where lance weapons maintain accuracy while remaining outside the effective envelope of macro cannon batteries. At these ranges, fleet formations maneuver for advantageous firing positions, while lance batteries duel across the void, their beams invisible in vacuum, but detectable through the energy blooms, where they strike void shields or penetrate to score hits on armored hulls. A well-trained lance battery crew can maintain firing rates of 1 salvo every 30 to 40 seconds, their weapons cycling through charge-fire-recharge sequences, while tech priests monitor power flow and cooling systems. The cumulative effect of sustained lance fire gradually depletes enemy void shields, each hit draining energy from shield generators until localized failures allow subsequent shots to penetrate and damage the hull beneath. The transition from lance duels to macro cannon range marks the most brutal phase of void combat, where fleets close to within 10,000 kilometers and begin exchanging broadsides with weapons that fire building-sized shells at targets close enough that gunnery crews can sometimes observe impacts through observation ports. Macro cannons represent the oldest and most reliable ship-killing weapons in the Imperial arsenal, their mechanisms simple enough that even poorly trained crews can operate them effectively, while their shells deliver devastating kinetic impacts that void shields struggle to deflect. A single macro cannon battery might consist of dozens of individual weapons mounted along a vessel's flank, each cannon firing independently but coordinated through the gunnery deck to concentrate fire against specific target zones. The broadside exchanges that characterize close-range void combat test both vessel durability and crew discipline under conditions that turn warships into floating hells. Macro cannon shells slam into void shields with impacts that shake vessels from prow to stern. The kinetic energy transfer rattling equipment loose and throwing crew members from their stations. When shields fail and shells penetrate to strike armor, the impacts tear through decks and compartments, venting atmosphere and killing anyone caught in the blast zone. Secondary explosions erupt as shells penetrate to ammunition stores or plasma conduits, the resulting detonations sometimes more destructive than the original hit. Damage control teams race through smoke-filled corridors to seal breaches, fight fires, and restore damaged systems, while the vessel continues maneuvering and firing despite accumulating damage that would cripple civilian ships. Fleet formations during broadside exchanges follow patterns that Navy officers term the wall of battle, where capital ships and cruisers form parallel lines presenting their broadsides to enemy formations, while escorts screen against torpedo attacks and enemy fighters. The wall formation maximizes the number of weapons that can engage enemy vessels simultaneously while maintaining enough spacing between friendly ships to prevent collisions during maneuvering. A properly formed wall of battle presents enemy forces with overlapping fields of fire, where attempting to close with any single vessel exposes the attacker to broadsides from multiple Imperial ships. The formation's weakness lies in its flanks, where enemy forces that maneuver successfully can cross the T by positioning themselves perpendicular to the Imperial line, where they can rake the formation from end to end, while only the forward and aft weapons of Imperial vessels can return fire. Crossing the T represents one of the most decisive tactical maneuvers in void warfare, its effectiveness proven across thousands of engagements spanning millennia. A fleet that successfully crosses the enemy's T can concentrate fire against individual enemy vessels in sequence, destroying or crippling each ship before moving to the next, while the enemy formation struggles to reorient. Navy tactical training emphasizes both achieving this position against enemy forces and preventing enemy fleets from achieving it against Imperial formations. The maneuver requires precise coordination between multiple vessels, with the flagship directing movements through tactical data streams while individual captains execute their assigned positions. A poorly coordinated attempt to cross the T leaves the attacking formation strung out and vulnerable to counterattack, making the maneuver one that only experienced fleet commanders attempt against competent opposition. Escort squadrons operating as wolf packs provide Imperial fleets with tactical flexibility that capital ship formations cannot match. A wolf pack typically consists of 4 to 6 frigates or destroyers operating under unified command, their smaller size and greater maneuverability allowing them to execute tactics that would prove impossible for battleships or cruisers. These squadrons specialize in several distinct roles within fleet engagements. Torpedo wolf packs close with enemy capital ships to launch spreads of plasma torpedoes, their small size and speed allowing them to penetrate enemy formations and deliver their ordnance before enemy batteries can concentrate fire effectively. Each torpedo in a spread masses several tons and carries enough plasma warhead to cripple a cruiser or severely damage a battleship, making successful torpedo attacks among the most cost-effective ways to eliminate enemy capital ships. The coordination required for effective wolfpack operations demands crews trained specifically for this type of warfare, their captains thinking in terms of pack tactics rather than individual ship actions. A wolf pack approaching an enemy capital ship splits into multiple elements that attack from different vectors simultaneously, forcing enemy point defense batteries to divide their attention between multiple threats. Some escorts serve as decoys, drawing enemy fire, while the actual torpedo carriers position for their attack runs. Others provide covering fire with lance weapons or macro cannons, their shots timed to hit enemy shields just before torpedoes arrive to maximize penetration chances. The entire attack sequence unfolds over minutes, with wolf pack elements coordinating through tight beam communications, while maintaining enough separation to prevent enemy batteries from engaging multiple escorts with single salvos. Fighter and bomber wings launched from Navy carriers add another dimension to fleet engagements. They're small craft capable of penetrating defensive formations to strike at enemy vessels with precision that capital ship weapons cannot match. Fury interceptors serve as fleet defense, their twin las cannons and maneuverability allowing them to intercept enemy bombers and torpedoes before they reach Imperial capital ships. A Fury pilot might spend an entire engagement flying combat air patrol patterns around friendly battleships, their auger displays showing dozens of potential threats that they must prioritize and engage in split-second decisions. The effectiveness of fighter screens often determines whether enemy torpedo attacks succeed or fail, as even a few interceptors breaking through to enemy bomber formations can disrupt attack runs sufficiently to prevent coordinated strikes. Starhawk bomber wings conduct precision strikes against enemy capital ships, their armor-piercing bombs and missiles targeting specific systems, rather than simply inflicting general damage. A bomber squadron approaching an enemy battleship receives targeting data from the fleet's auger arrays identifying weak points in the enemy's defenses, locations where void shields show gaps, or where previous damage has compromised hull integrity. The bombers approach in tight formation, their combined point defense providing mutual protection against enemy fighters while they push through defensive fire to reach release points. The bombs themselves carry enough explosive force to penetrate deep into enemy vessels before detonating, their shaped charges designed to maximize internal damage rather than simply cratering the hull. Successful bomber strikes can disable enemy weapons' batteries, cripple engines, or even trigger catastrophic reactor failures that destroy vessels from within. The hammer and anvil approach to combined Navy and Space Marine operations represents perhaps the most devastating tactical combination available to Imperial forces. Navy vessels serve as the anvil, engaging enemy fleets in conventional void combat that fixes enemy forces in place and prevents them from maneuvering freely. While enemy commanders focus on the naval engagement, Space Marine strike cruisers and battle barges approach from unexpected vectors, their heavily armored hulls weathering defensive fire as they close to boarding range. The Space Marines serve as the hammer, their boarding actions striking at enemy capital ships with overwhelming force that conventional void combat could not achieve in reasonable timeframes. A coordinated hammer and anvil operation might see Navy battleships exchanging broadsides with enemy capital ships for hours, gradually wearing down enemy shields and inflicting cumulative damage, while Space Marine vessels maneuver into position for boarding assaults that decide the engagement in minutes once contact is achieved. The execution of hammer and anvil tactics requires extensive coordination between Navy and Space Marine commanders, their forces operating according to fundamentally different doctrines that must somehow mesh into coherent combined operations. Navy commanders must maintain pressure on enemy forces without becoming so heavily engaged that they cannot disengage if Space Marine boarding actions fail or enemy reinforcements arrive. Space Marine commanders must time their approaches to coincide with moments when enemy forces are fully committed to the naval engagement and cannot redirect sufficient firepower to repel boarding attempts. The communication between Navy and Space Marine vessels during these operations flows through dedicated tactical channels, where liaison officers translate between Navy tactical terminology and Space Marine operational language, ensuring that both forces understand the overall plan despite their different perspectives on void warfare. Planetary assault operations represent the ultimate test of coordination between multiple Imperial military branches, requiring Navy orbital bombardment, Space Marine rapid insertion, and Imperial Guard mass landings to function as integrated components of a single campaign. The operation begins with Navy vessels achieving orbital superiority through the destruction or suppression of enemy orbital defenses and any hostile fleet elements. This phase might last hours or weeks depending on enemy strength, with Navy vessels systematically eliminating defense platforms, orbital fortresses, and ground-based defense lasers that could threaten subsequent landing operations. The bombardment that accompanies this phase serves both tactical and strategic purposes, destroying enemy military installations while simultaneously demonstrating Imperial power to populations below who witness the destruction raining from orbit. Once orbital superiority is established, Navy vessels transition to providing fire support for ground operations while maintaining blockade positions that prevent enemy reinforcement or evacuation. Bombardment cruisers position themselves in geosynchronous orbits above target zones, their weapons batteries loaded with specialized munitions selected for specific tactical effects. High explosive shells reduce fortifications to rubble, their detonations visible from orbit as massive fireballs that consume entire city blocks. Incendiary rounds set forests ablaze or create firestorms in urban areas, denying enemy forces cover and disrupting their movements. Penetrator rounds punch deep underground to collapse tunnel systems or destroy bunker complexes that conventional bombardment cannot reach. The targeting data for these bombardments comes from multiple sources including orbital auger scans, reconnaissance aircraft operating in atmosphere, and ground forces who designate targets through laser markers or Vox communication. Space Marine deployment during planetary assaults emphasizes speed and precision over the methodical approach that characterizes Imperial Guard operations. Drop pod assaults deliver Space Marines directly into combat zones within minutes of launch, their pods streaking through atmosphere as burning meteors that impact with enough force to create small craters. The Space Marines emerge into combat immediately, their surprise arrival and superhuman capabilities allowing them to seize objectives that conventional forces would require hours or days to approach. Thunderhawk insertions provide more controlled deployment options, the gunships landing in secured zones where Space Marines can disembark with their vehicles and heavy equipment before advancing on objectives. These initial Space Marine operations focus on high-value targets like enemy command centers, strategic choke points, or defensive positions whose elimination opens paths for subsequent Guard landings. The coordination between Space Marine assault forces and Navy orbital fire support requires precise timing and communication to prevent friendly fire incidents while maximizing the effectiveness of both elements. Space Marine Forward observers designate targets for naval bombardment using encrypted tactical channels, their requests prioritized over Guard fire support requests due to Space Marine operational importance and the time-sensitive nature of their missions. A Space Marine assault on an enemy fortress might begin with naval bombardment that suppresses defensive positions and breaches outer walls, followed immediately by drop pod assault that delivers Space Marines into the breach sections before defenders can recover. The Space Marines then fight through the fortress interior, while Navy vessels shift fire to prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching the battle, their bombardment creating a cordon of destruction around the objective that isolates it from external support. Imperial Guard mass landings follow once Space Marines have secured initial objectives and Navy vessels have suppressed major defensive positions. The Guard descends in waves of drop ships and bulk landers, each vessel carrying hundreds of troops along with their vehicles, artillery, and supplies. These landings occur at designated landing zones that Space Marines have cleared or that Navy bombardment has rendered safe enough for the vulnerable transport craft. The drop ships execute combat landings under fire, their armored hulls absorbing hits from small arms and light anti-aircraft weapons, while their door guns suppress enemy positions around landing zones. Bulk landers make single-use descents, their massive hulls too damaged by atmospheric entry and landing to ever return to orbit, but their cargo capacity allows them to deliver entire regiments with their full equipment in single lifts. The buildup of Guard forces on planetary surfaces transforms initial assault operations into sustained campaigns where numerical superiority and logistical endurance determine outcomes. Navy vessels continue providing orbital fire support throughout these campaigns, their bombardments called in by Guard artillery observers who coordinate naval gunfire with ground-based artillery to create overwhelming concentrations of firepower against enemy strongpoints. The Navy also maintains the supply chain that keeps Guard forces operational, with cargo shuttles ferrying ammunition, rations, fuel, and reinforcements from orbital depots to ground-based supply dumps. This logistical effort often proves more challenging than the initial assault, as maintaining supply lines across hostile planetary surfaces requires constant effort against enemy interdiction attempts. The importance of augur arrays to void warfare doctrine cannot be overstated, as these sensor systems provide the information that commanders need to make tactical decisions in an environment where visual observation proves nearly useless. A warship's augur arrays scan across multiple spectrums simultaneously, detecting everything from electromagnetic emissions to gravitational distortions to warp signatures. The data streams from these sensors flow to augur stations, where specialized crew members interpret the information and translate it into tactical displays that show enemy positions, velocities, and probable identities. The quality of a vessel's augur arrays often determines whether it detects enemy forces before being detected itself, a critical advantage that allows commanders to position their forces optimally before engagement begins. Void shields represent the primary defensive system, protecting Imperial warships from enemy fire, their energy barriers deflecting or absorbing incoming fire before it can damage the hull beneath. A typical capital ship mounts multiple void shield generators positioned throughout the vessel, each generator projecting a localized shield that covers a specific section of the hull. The shields operate by creating a barrier that exists partially in the warp, shunting incoming energy and kinetic impacts into the Imperium where they dissipate harmlessly. This mechanism provides effective protection against most conventional weapons, but requires enormous power to maintain, with shield generators drawing directly from the vessel's plasma reactors. The shields can absorb tremendous punishment, but eventually fail under sustained bombardment as generators overload or power supplies deplete, leaving sections of hull exposed to direct fire. The Geller field generators that protect vessels during warp transit serve an entirely different purpose than void shields, but prove equally essential to Imperial naval operations. These devices create a bubble of real space around the vessel that prevents the raw chaos of the warp from touching the ship or its crew. Without functional Geller fields, a vessel entering the warp would be instantly overwhelmed by demonic entities drawn to the souls aboard, its crew driven mad or possessed within seconds. The importance of Geller field maintenance means that tech priests monitor these systems constantly, performing rituals and maintenance that keep the ancient mechanisms functioning despite their age. The failure of a Geller field during warp transit represents one of the most catastrophic events that can befall a vessel, as the crew has no defense against the horrors that pour through the failing barrier. The machine spirits inhabiting ancient vessels provide tactical advantages that newer ships cannot match, their accumulated experience and semi-sentient awareness allowing them to respond to threats with initiative that purely mechanical systems lack. A vessel whose machine spirit has fought in hundreds of battles develops instincts about void combat that manifest as seemingly autonomous responses to tactical situations. The weapon's batteries might adjust their firing solutions without crew input, compensating for enemy maneuvers through patterns the machine spirit recognizes from previous engagements. The engines might execute evasive maneuvers that the helmsman had not yet ordered, the machine spirit responding to threats detected through the vessel's auger arrays faster than human crew could process the information. These behaviors prove most pronounced in vessels dating from the Great Crusade or earlier, their machine spirits having accumulated 10,000 years of combat experience that makes them invaluable assets despite the challenges of maintaining such ancient ships. The relationship between a vessel's crew and its machine spirit determines how effectively the ship performs in combat, with experienced crews learning to work with their machine spirit's tendencies rather than fighting against them. Tech priests conduct daily rituals that maintain the machine spirit's cooperation, their prayers and offerings ensuring that the spirit remains content and willing to function at full capacity. A displeased machine spirit might allow systems to fail at critical moments or refuse to operate at full efficiency, its passive resistance crippling the vessel's combat effectiveness. The most skilled tech priests develop relationships with their vessel's machine spirits that approach genuine communication, their understanding of the spirit's preferences and habits allowing them to coax maximum performance from ancient systems that lesser tech priests could not maintain. The construction of Imperial warships occurs in orbital facilities that dwarf the vessels they produce, massive structures that represent thousands of years of accumulated infrastructure investment and technical knowledge. The greatest of these shipyards orbit Mars, where the Adeptus Mechanicus maintains construction facilities dating back to the Age of Strife and possibly earlier. The ring of iron surrounding Mars consists of hundreds of individual orbital plates, each plate measuring dozens of kilometers across and containing multiple construction berths, forge complexes, and habitation zones for the millions of workers who labor there. The oldest sections of the ring incorporate technologies that modern tech priests maintain through ritual rather than understanding, their construction methods lost during Old Night, but their functionality preserved through 10 millennia of careful maintenance and religious devotion. The process of building a warship begins years before any physical construction occurs. as tech priests consult ancient data cores containing approved ship patterns and prepare the construction rituals necessary to begin work. Every vessel built in Imperial shipyards follows a standard template construct pattern, designs that date back to the dark age of technology, when human civilization reached heights of technical achievement that the Imperium can no longer match. The SDC patterns exist as complete manufacturing databases that specify every component, every system, and every construction step necessary to produce a functional vessel. The Mechanicus guards these patterns with religious fervor, as they represent humanity's greatest technical achievements and the foundation of all Imperial technology. Any deviation from approved SDC patterns constitutes tech heresy, a crime that can result in execution for the tech priest responsible and potential sanctions against their entire Forge world. The construction times required for Imperial warships reflect both the vessel's immense complexity and the Imperium's limited industrial capacity compared to its territorial scope. An escort vessel, like a sword-class frigate, requires between 5 and 15 years to complete from the moment its keel is laid to its commissioning ceremony. The variation in construction time depends on factors including the shipyard's available resources, the number of other vessels competing for construction priority, and whether the shipyard possesses all necessary components or must wait for deliveries from other Forge worlds. A frigate's construction begins with the laying of its keel, a massive structural spine that will support the entire vessel. Work crews assemble this spine from prefabricated sections manufactured in the shipyard's forge complexes, each section blessed by tech priests before installation to ensure the machine spirit will accept it as part of the whole. The hull takes shape around this spine over months or years, with work crews welding armor plates into place while other teams install the vessel's internal structure. The construction occurs in vacuum, with workers in void suits or enclosed work vehicles maneuvering massive hull sections into position using magnetic grapples and positioning thrusters. The interior spaces take form as bulkheads divide the hull into compartments, each section sealed and pressure tested before work proceeds to the next. The installation of major systems follows a carefully prescribed sequence, with plasma reactors positioned first to provide power for subsequent construction phases. The reactor installation requires extensive rituals conducted by senior tech priests, their prayers ensuring that the reactor's machine spirit awakens properly and accepts its role powering the vessel. The weapon systems installation represents one of the most critical construction phases, as these systems must integrate with the vessel's power grid, targeting cogitators, and structural supports in ways that allow them to function under combat stress. Macro cannon batteries require massive mounting points that distribute recoil forces throughout the hull structure, their installation demanding precision that prevents stress fractures during firing. Lance weapons need direct connections to the plasma reactors, their enormous power requirements necessitating dedicated conduits that can handle the energy flow without overheating. Torpedo tubes integrate with automated loading systems that draw ordnance from magazines deep within the hull, their mechanisms tested repeatedly to ensure reliable function when the vessel enters combat. Cruiser construction extends the timeline dramatically, with light cruisers requiring 20 to 40 years and standard cruisers like the Lunar class or Gothic class demanding 50 to 90 years from keel laying to commissioning. The increased construction time reflects not just the vessel's larger size, but their greater systems complexity and the higher quality standards applied to cruiser construction. A cruiser serves as the backbone of Imperial naval power, expected to operate independently for extended periods while maintaining combat effectiveness against threats ranging from pirate raiders to enemy capital ships. This operational requirement demands redundant systems, extensive repair facilities, and robust construction that can withstand battle damage without catastrophic failure. The Lunar-class cruiser pattern exemplifies the standard Imperial cruiser design philosophy, its hull measuring 4.5 kilometers in length and mounting weapons batteries, along both flanks supplemented by prow-mounted lances. The construction of a lunar class begins with a keel section that incorporates structural reinforcement beyond what escort vessels require, the additional bracing necessary to support the stresses that broadside firing imposes on the hull. The armor plating used in cruiser construction runs thicker than escort armor, with some sections incorporating layered ceramite and adamantium that can withstand direct hits from enemy macro cannons. The installation of this armor alone consumes years of construction time, as each plate must be fitted precisely and welded with techniques that ensure the armor maintains its integrity under combat stress. The weapons batteries aboard a lunar class include dozens of individual macro cannons organized into port and starboard batteries, each battery controlled from a dedicated gunnery deck where crews coordinate fire against enemy vessels. The installation of these batteries requires constructing the gunnery decks themselves, positioning the cannons within armored turrets that protect them from enemy fire, and connecting each weapon to ammunition hoists that draw shells from magazines positioned deep within the hull for protection. The Lance batteries mounted in the lunar classes demand even more careful installation, as these energy weapons require direct power feeds from the plasma reactors and cooling systems capable of dissipating the tremendous heat generated during firing sequences. Battleship construction represents the pinnacle of Imperial shipbuilding capability, with vessels like the Emperor class requiring 100 to 200 years to complete. The shipyards capable of constructing battleships exist only at the most important forge worlds and naval bases, their facilities incorporating construction berths large enough to accommodate vessels measuring 12 kilometers in length. The Emperor-class pattern dates from the 32nd millennium, a period when the Imperium still possessed sufficient industrial capacity and technical knowledge to undertake such massive construction projects. Modern shipyards build Emperor-class battleships by following the original STC pattern exactly, their tech priests consulting ancient data cores for guidance on construction techniques that earlier generations understood better than current mechanicus adepts. The keel of an Emperor-class battleship masses more than some escort vessels in its entirety, a structural spine engineered to support weapons batteries that can engage multiple enemy capital ships simultaneously. The construction crews who work on battleship projects often spend their entire careers on a single vessel, their children and grandchildren continuing the work after they retire or die. This generational approach to construction creates situations where the workers feel personal connections to the vessels they build, viewing the ship as a legacy project that represents their family's contribution to Imperial naval power. The tech priests overseeing construction maintain detailed records of every worker's contribution, these records preserved in the vessel's data cores so that future generations can honor those whose labor created the ship. The major shipyards of the Imperium each specialize in particular vessel types based on their facilities and accumulated expertise. Mars maintains the capacity to construct any class of Imperial warship, its shipyards having built vessels ranging from escorts to the massive Arc Mechanicus ships that serve as mobile forge worlds. The Mechanicus reserves Mars' shipyard capacity primarily for its own vessels, with Navy construction occurring only when political considerations or direct orders from the Fabricator General mandate it. Vos in Segmentum Obscurus specializes in cruiser construction, its yards producing Lunar-class and Dictator-class cruisers that form the backbone of Battle Fleet Obscurus. The quality of Vos-built cruisers earns them reputations as reliable vessels that perform consistently even under the demanding conditions of extended patrol operations. Cipra Mundi serves as the primary naval construction facility for Segmentum Pacificus, its orbital yards capable of building everything from escorts to battleships. The shipyards orbit a forge world that specializes in armor plate production, giving Cipra Mundi-built vessels reputations for exceptional durability. Navy captains request assignment to Cipra Mundi-built ships when possible, knowing that the extra armor thickness incorporated into vessels from these yards provides additional protection during combat. BACA in the Gothic sector maintains extensive construction facilities that support Battle Fleet Gothic, one of the largest concentrations of Imperial naval power outside the Sol system. The Bacca yards specialize in rapid escort construction, their streamlined processes allowing them to complete frigate-class vessels in as little as 3 years when resources permit. Hydrafor serves as another major naval construction center, its yards producing cruisers and battleships for Battle Fleet Obscurus, while also conducting extensive repair and refit operations. The Hydrafor facilities include some of the largest dry docks in the Imperium, their berths capable of accommodating battleships for major overhauls that might last decades. The shipyard workers at Hydrafor inherit their positions through family lines stretching back thousands of years, their accumulated practical knowledge supplementing the technical expertise of Mechanicus overseers. A master shipwright at Hydrafor might know construction tricks passed down through 50 generations of their family, techniques that improve efficiency or quality in ways that SDC patterns do not explicitly specify, but that experience has proven effective. The standard template construct origins of Imperial ship designs create both advantages and severe limitations for the Imperium's naval capabilities. The SDC patterns provide complete, proven designs that function reliably when constructed according to specifications. A lunar-class cruiser built at Cypra Mundi operates identically to one built at Bacca or Mars, their systems interchangeable, and their performance characteristics predictable. This standardization allows the Navy to maintain supply chains and training programs that work across all vessels of a given class, as crews transferring between ships encounter familiar systems, regardless of where their new vessel was constructed. The patterns also incorporate design features that human engineers developed during the dark age of technology, solutions to engineering problems that represented the pinnacle of human technical achievement. The loss of innovation capacity represents the dark side of the Imperium's dependence on SDC patterns. The Mechanicus no longer understands the fundamental principles underlying many systems incorporated into SDC designs, maintaining them through accumulated practical knowledge and religious ritual rather than genuine comprehension. This knowledge gap means the Mechanicus cannot modify existing designs or develop new patterns suited to changed circumstances. When the Imperium encounters new threats that existing ship designs handle poorly, the Mechanicus lacks the capability to develop improved patterns that address these weaknesses. The ships the Imperium builds in the 41st millennium follow patterns established during the Great Crusade or earlier, their designs optimized for threats and tactical situations that existed 10,000 years ago. The Imperium maintains these ancient patterns because it has no choice. The alternative to building ships according to SDC patterns would be attempting to design new vessels without the technical knowledge necessary to ensure they function properly. The few times that ambitious tech priests have attempted to modify SDC patterns or develop new designs, the results have ranged from vessels that perform worse than standard patterns to catastrophic failures, where ships broke apart during their maiden voyages or suffered reactor failures that destroyed them and their construction facilities. These failures reinforce Mechanicus orthodoxy that treats any deviation from approved patterns as dangerous heresy, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where technical stagnation persists because attempts at innovation end in disaster. The most common ship classes in Imperial service reflect strategic priorities established during the Great Crusade and refined over subsequent millennia. The Sword-class frigate serves as the standard escort for Navy operations, its balanced design incorporating adequate firepower, decent armor, and reliable engines in a package that shipyards can construct relatively quickly. Thousands of Sword-class frigates patrol Imperial space lanes, escort merchant convoys, and form screening elements for larger fleet formations. The pattern's longevity speaks to its effectiveness, as the Sword class has served the Imperium for over 10,000 years without any successful challenger to its position as the standard frigate design. The Firestorm-class frigate represents a specialized variant that trades some of the Sword class's balanced capabilities for enhanced lance armament. A Firestorm mounts a prow-mounted lance battery that gives it anti-ship capabilities exceeding standard frigates, making it effective in squadron operations, where multiple firestorms can concentrate their lance fire against enemy capital ships. The pattern sees less widespread use than the sword class due to its higher construction costs and the specialized training its crews require, but squadrons of firestorms serve in most major fleet formations, where their enhanced firepower justifies the additional investment. The Cobra-class destroyer emphasizes speed and torpedo armament over the balanced approach of the sword class. A Cobra masses less than a sword-class frigate and mounts lighter armor, but its engines provide superior acceleration, and its torpedo tubes give it ship-killing capability that standard frigates lack. Cobra squadrons operate as fast attack elements, their tactics emphasizing hit-and-run strikes where they close rapidly with enemy vessels, launch torpedo spreads, and withdraw before enemy batteries can concentrate fire effectively. The pattern requires skilled crews who can execute these demanding maneuvers under combat stress, making Cobra squadrons elite units within escort flotillas. The Lunar-class cruiser dominates Imperial cruiser construction, its pattern accounting for more active cruisers than any other design. The balanced armament of weapons batteries and lance weapons makes the Lunar class effective against diverse threats, while its armor and void shields provide adequate protection for independent operations. Navy doctrine considers the Lunar class the baseline against which other cruiser designs are measured, with variants and specialized patterns evaluated based on how they differ from the Lunar class standard. The pattern's ubiquity means that nearly every Navy officer serves aboard a Lunar class at some point during their career, their familiarity with the design creating institutional knowledge that reinforces its dominance. The Gothic-class cruiser trades some of the Lunar class's lance capability for enhanced torpedo armament, its prow-mounting torpedo tubes that give it alpha strike capability exceeding standard cruisers. Gothic-class cruisers serve as heavy assault units in fleet formations, their torpedo spreads capable of crippling enemy capital ships when launched in coordinated salvos. The pattern sees particular favor in fleets operating in regions where enemy forces favor heavily armored vessels that resist conventional weapons fire, as torpedo strikes can penetrate armor that macro cannon shells merely crater. The Dictator-class cruiser represents the Navy's primary carrier platform, its hull modified to incorporate extensive launch bays for fighter and bomber wings. A Dictator carries attack craft complements that rival dedicated carriers despite its cruiser displacement, making it a versatile platform that combines fleet carrier capabilities with cruiser weight armament. The pattern serves in fleets that emphasize strike craft operations, with Dictator squadrons providing the attack craft that screen friendly capital ships and strike at enemy formations. The specialized nature of carrier operations means that Dictators require crews trained specifically for strike craft coordination, their officers learning tactics that differ significantly from standard cruiser operations. The Emperor-class battleship represents the standard Imperial capital ship, its pattern dating from the 32nd millennium, when the Imperium still possessed the industrial capacity for regular battleship construction. An Emperor class mounts weapons batteries along both flanks capable of engaging multiple enemy capital ships simultaneously, while its prow-mounted Nova cannon provides long-range strike capability that can devastate enemy formations before conventional engagement ranges. The armor protecting an Emperor class exceeds that of any cruiser by significant margins, layered ceramite and adamantium plates thick enough to withstand sustained bombardment from enemy capital ships. The pattern's age means that many Emperor-class battleships in service date back centuries or millennia, their hulls bearing battle honors from campaigns spanning Imperial history. The Retribution-class battleship emphasizes lance armament over the Emperor-class's balanced weapons loadout, its flanks mounting lance batteries that can engage enemy capital ships at ranges where conventional weapons prove ineffective. The pattern serves in fleets that favor long-range gunnery duels, with Retribution-class battleships forming the core of battle lines that seek to destroy enemy vessels through sustained lance fire before closing to macro cannon range. The specialized armament makes Retributions more expensive to construct and maintain than Emperor-class battleships, limiting their numbers compared to the more common pattern. The Apocalypse-class battleship represents the Navy's primary carrier battleship, its hull incorporating both capital ship armament and extensive launch bays for strike craft operations. An Apocalypse can deploy fighter and bomber wings that rival dedicated carriers while maintaining battleship-grade weapons batteries and armor. The pattern serves as flagship for fleet commanders who favor strike craft operations, providing them with a command platform that combines capital ship durability with carrier strike capability. The complexity of Apocalypse-class systems makes them challenging to maintain, requiring tech priest crews larger than standard battleships need and consuming resources that could maintain multiple smaller vessels. Rare and ancient patterns maintained by the Imperium include vessels whose construction techniques have been partially or completely lost, making them irreplaceable assets that diminish permanently when destroyed. The Gloriana-class battleships built during the Great Crusade to serve as Primarch flagships represent the pinnacle of Imperial warship construction, their hulls measuring 15 kilometers or more and mounting armament that exceeds standard battleships by orders of magnitude. The Mukraga's Honor serves as flagship for the Ultramarines, its systems incorporating technologies that the Mechanicus maintains through ritual despite no longer understanding their fundamental principles. The vessel survived 10,000 years of continuous operation through careful maintenance and the dedication of tech priests who treat its machine's spirit with religious reverence. Pre-heresy designs like the Furious-class Grand Cruiser represent patterns that the Imperium built in large numbers during the Great Crusade, but abandoned in subsequent millennia due to resource constraints or doctrinal changes. A Furious class mounts armament approaching battleship levels while maintaining cruiser-grade speed and maneuverability, making it an effective heavy assault platform. The pattern fell out of favor during the 33rd millennium when resource shortages forced the Imperium to prioritize construction of standard cruisers and battleships over specialized designs. The Furious-class vessels remaining in service represent survivors from earlier construction runs, their hulls maintained through careful preservation, but irreplaceable if destroyed. Navy commanders treasure assignment to these rare vessels, their command representing both professional achievement and the responsibility of preserving irreplaceable assets. The mystery surrounding lost construction techniques creates situations where the Imperium maintains vessels it cannot replicate, their systems functioning through accumulated maintenance knowledge rather than genuine understanding. The Volkite weapons that some pre-heresy vessels mount represent technology that the Mechanicus can maintain but cannot manufacture, their thermal ray projectors incorporating principles that modern tech priests observe functioning but cannot reproduce. When these weapons fail beyond repair, the vessels mounting them lose capabilities that cannot be restored, their armament permanently reduced. Similar situations exist with specialized shield generators, auger arrays, and propulsion systems whose construction methods died with the tech priests who understood them during the heresy or subsequent millennia. The Imperium's ability to project power across a million worlds depends absolutely on navigators, a subspecies of humanity whose genetic mutation allows them to perceive the currents of the warp through their third eye. Without these mutants, Imperial vessels would be restricted to short, blind jumps through the immaterium, their crews hoping to emerge somewhere near their intended destinations after weeks or months of subjective time spent traveling distances that might span only a few light years. The navigator houses maintain a monopoly on this capability that predates the Imperium itself, their bloodlines carefully cultivated over thousands of generations to preserve and enhance the mutation that makes warp navigation possible. A navigator aboard a vessel can perceive the Astronomican, the psychic beacon emanating from Terra, and use it as a reference point to chart courses through the warp that would be impossible for anyone lacking their unique sight. The third eye that distinguishes navigators from baseline humanity remains hidden behind a band of flesh on their foreheads during normal circumstances, but when opened it reveals an organ that exists partially outside normal space-time. Through this eye, a navigator perceives the warp not as the howling chaos that would drive normal humans mad within seconds, but as a navigable medium with currents, eddies, and relatively stable channels. The process of warp navigation requires the navigator to enter a specialized chamber called the oculus navis, typically positioned at the vessel's prow, where the gellar field's influence remains strongest. Within this chamber, the navigator opens their third eye and extends their perception into the Imperium, while the vessel's gellar field protects them from direct contact with the entities that inhabit that realm. What the navigator sees during warp transit defies description in terms that baseline humans can comprehend. The Imperium exists outside the laws of physics that govern real space, its substance shaped by psychic emanations from sentient beings throughout the galaxy. Emotions, thoughts, and souls create currents in the warp that the navigator must interpret and navigate around or through depending on their intensity and direction. The Astronomican appears to navigator's sight as a brilliant light cutting through the chaos, its beam originating from Terra and extending outward for roughly 50,000 light-years in all directions. This beacon provides the fixed reference point that allows navigators to determine their position within the warp and plot courses toward their destinations. Without the Astronomican, navigators could still perceive the warp, but they would lack any reference frame for determining direction or distance, making long-range navigation effectively impossible. The political power of the navigator houses stems directly from this monopoly on interstellar travel. Every vessel that travels through the warp requires a navigator aboard, creating demand that far exceeds supply despite the houses maintaining thousands of navigators across the Imperium. The houses negotiate contracts with navy commands, merchant consortiums, rogue traders, and other organizations that operate void-going vessels, their fees representing significant percentages of voyage revenues. A merchant vessel might dedicate 20% of its cargo capacity to paying the navigator house that provides its navigator, while Navy vessels operate under standing contracts negotiated between the houses and the Admiralty that guarantee navigators for military vessels in exchange for various considerations, including legal protections and monopoly enforcement. The navigator houses themselves operate as aristocratic dynasties whose wealth and influence rival planetary governors and sector nobility. Houses like Belisarius, Nostromo, and Ptolemy maintain estates on Terra and other major worlds, their compounds incorporating facilities for training young navigators and conducting the genetic screening necessary to identify which children inherit the navigator gene. The houses guard their bloodlines obsessively, their marriages arranged to preserve genetic purity and prevent dilution of the navigator mutation. A navigator from a prestigious house commands higher fees and better assignments than one from a minor house, creating internal hierarchies within the Navis Nobilite that reflect both genetic quality and political connections. The relationship between navigator houses and other imperial institutions remains complicated by the house's unique legal status. The Navis Nobilite answers directly to the Paternoval Envoy, one of the High Lords of Terra, who represents navigator interests in the highest councils of imperial government. This direct representation ensures that navigator concerns receive consideration at the highest levels of imperial policy making, while simultaneously creating a power base that the houses leverage to maintain their monopoly against potential challenges. The Adeptus Mechanicus has occasionally attempted to develop alternative navigation methods that would break the navigator monopoly, but these efforts consistently fail or produce results so inferior to navigator guidance that they prove impractical for regular use. The training required to produce a functional navigator begins in childhood and continues for decades before a young navigator undertakes their first real voyage. The houses maintain scholams where children who inherit the navigator gene learn to control their mutation, opening and closing their third eye at will rather than allowing it to manifest randomly. The early training emphasizes mental discipline and psychic shielding, as young navigators must learn to perceive the warp without being overwhelmed by what they see. Many trainees fail this initial phase, their minds unable to process warp sight without descending into madness. The houses dispose of these failures quietly, their genetic material still valuable for breeding purposes even if the individuals themselves cannot function as working navigators. Advanced training involves supervised warp transits, where experienced navigators guide trainees through increasingly challenging navigation scenarios. A trainee might begin with short jumps through well-mapped warp routes, where the currents remain relatively stable, their mentor navigator present in the oculus navis to intervene if the trainee loses their way. As the trainee's skills develop, they progress to longer voyages through less stable regions, eventually undertaking independent navigation of routes that require interpreting complex warp currents and adjusting course in real time to avoid dangerous phenomena. The final examination involves navigating a vessel through a previously uncharted region of the warp, demonstrating that the trainee can function independently when established routes prove unavailable or impassable. The Astronomican itself represents one of the Imperium's most critical assets and one of its greatest vulnerabilities simultaneously. The beacon originates from the Astronomican chamber deep within the Imperial Palace on Terra, where a choir of 10,000 psychers channels their combined psychic power through a mechanism that focuses and amplifies their output into the beam that navigators perceive across half the galaxy. The Emperor himself directs this choir from his position on the Golden Throne, his vast psychic presence shaping the raw power the psychers provide into the coherent signal that makes long-range navigation possible. The psychers who form the choir burn out rapidly under the strain, their souls consumed by the effort of maintaining the beacon. Each psycher survives only a few months before their life force exhausts completely, requiring constant replacement from the black ship's tithes to maintain the choir's strength. The reach of the Astronomican defines the practical boundaries of reliable Imperial space. Within roughly 50,000 light-years of Terra, navigators can perceive the beacon clearly enough to use it for precise navigation, allowing vessels to make warp jumps of weeks or months of subjective time that cover thousands of light-years of real space distance. Beyond this range, the Astronomican's light dims to the point where navigators struggle to perceive it clearly, forcing vessels to make shorter jumps and navigate using less reliable methods. The regions beyond the Astronomican's reach remain accessible to Imperial ships, but travel there requires significantly more time and carries much higher risks of vessels becoming lost in the warp or emerging far from their intended destinations. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum during the 42nd millennium fundamentally altered the strategic situation regarding warp travel and the Astronomican's effectiveness. The Great Rift tore across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Haydex anomaly, creating a barrier of warp storms so violent that conventional navigation through the affected regions became effectively impossible. The rift divided the Imperium into two distinct regions: Imperium Sanctus on the Terra side of the rift, where the Astronomican remains visible and warp travel continues according to established patterns, and Imperium Nihilus on the far side, where the rift's interference blocks or distorts the Astronomican's light. Navigators operating in Imperium Nihilus report that the beacon appears dimmed, flickering, or completely invisible depending on local warp conditions, forcing them to navigate using alternative methods that prove far less reliable than following the Astronomican. The strategic implications of this division cannot be overstated. Imperium Nihilus contains thousands of worlds that suddenly found themselves cut off from Terra and the broader Imperium, their distress calls unable to reach across the rift, and reinforcements unable to navigate the warp storms to provide assistance. Some regions of Nihilus maintain limited contact with Sanctus through dangerous routes that skilled navigators can traverse during periods when the rift's storms temporarily abate, but these windows prove unpredictable and short-lived. Other regions remain completely isolated, their populations left to face threats ranging from xenos invasions to chaos incursions without hope of Imperial support. The political ramifications include the emergence of local powers who rule their regions independently, some maintaining loyalty to the Imperium despite their isolation, while others drift toward independence or outright rebellion. Warp route mapping represents one of the Navigator House's most valuable services and most closely guarded secrets. Over millennia of warp travel, navigators have identified routes through the Imperium where the currents remain relatively stable and predictable, allowing vessels to traverse specific real space distances with reasonable confidence about their arrival times and locations. These stable routes form the backbone of imperial commerce and military logistics, their paths connecting major worlds and allowing regular traffic between systems that might be separated by thousands of light years. A stable route between Forge World and Hive World enables the regular trade that keeps both worlds functioning, while stable military routes allow Navy fleets to reinforce threatened sectors with some confidence that their vessels will arrive in time to affect the strategic situation. The difference between stable routes and dangerous passages becomes apparent when examining the risks associated with each. A stable route might allow a vessel to travel 5,000 light years with only a 10% chance of significant deviation from the intended destination, and perhaps a 5% chance of encountering warp phenomena dangerous enough to threaten the vessel. The subjective time aboard ship during such a journey might range from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on current warp conditions, with the navigator able to provide reasonably accurate estimates of arrival time before departure. A dangerous passage through unstable regions might cover the same real space distance, with a 40% chance of significant deviation, a 20% chance of encountering dangerous phenomena, and subjective travel times that could range from days to years, with no way to predict which extreme a particular voyage might experience. The navigator houses maintain detailed charts of known warp routes, their archives containing information accumulated over thousands of years of travel. These charts note not just the routes themselves, but also temporal data about how warp conditions along each route vary over time. Some routes prove reliably stable year after year, their currents maintaining consistent patterns that navigators can predict with reasonable accuracy. Other routes fluctuate, their stability waxing and waning according to patterns that the houses study but do not fully understand. The most valuable charts identify routes that remain stable even when surrounding regions become impassable, allowing continued travel between critical systems when broader warp conditions deteriorate. The Great Rift's opening rendered many established routes completely impassable, while simultaneously creating new routes through regions that previously proved too dangerous for regular navigation. The massive warp storms that form the rift itself cannot be crossed by conventional means, but the disturbances the rift created in surrounding regions altered warp currents in ways that opened passages through areas that navigators previously avoided. Some of these new routes prove more stable than the old paths they replace, their currents channeled by the rift's presence into predictable flows that skilled navigators can follow. Other new routes remain dangerously unstable, their temporary nature meaning they might close without warning and trap vessels attempting to use them. The Nachman Gauntlet represents the most significant of these new routes, a narrow passage through the Great Rift that connects Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. The gauntlet formed when the rift's storms created a relatively stable channel through what would otherwise be completely impassable warp space. Navigators who traverse the gauntlet report that the passage remains narrow and treacherous, its currents violent enough that only the most skilled navigators should attempt the crossing. The strategic importance of the gauntlet led to intense military operations to secure both ends of the passage, as control over this route determines whether reinforcements and supplies can reach Imperium Nihilus from Terra. Enemy forces understand this as well, making the regions around the gauntlet's endpoint sites of constant warfare as various factions attempt to control or close this critical passage. The dangers inherent in warp travel extend far beyond simple navigation challenges. Every vessel that enters the Immaterium risks catastrophic failure of the systems that protect it from the warp's reality corroding influence. The Gellar field represents the primary defense, its bubble of real space shielding the vessel and its crew from direct contact with the warp. When a Gellar field fails during transit, the results prove universally catastrophic. The barrier between real space and the Immaterium collapses, allowing demons and raw warp energy to flood into the vessel. The crew experiences this as reality itself breaking down around them, the ship's corridors twisting into impossible geometries, while entities that should not exist in real space manifest throughout the vessel. The few documented cases of vessels surviving Geller field failures involve situations where the field collapsed only briefly before backup generators restored it, or where the failure occurred just as the vessel was translating back into real space. In these cases, the demonic incursion remained limited to specific sections of the ship that the crew could seal off and purge. More typically, Geller field failure results in the complete loss of the vessel and everyone aboard, their souls consumed by demons, while the ship itself becomes a haunted wreck drifting through the warp. These ghost ships occasionally emerge into real space decades or centuries after their loss, their hulls bearing evidence of the horrors that occurred aboard them. Navy protocol calls for the immediate destruction of any vessel recovered under such circumstances, as the demonic taint that permeates them proves impossible to cleanse completely. Demonic incursion during warp travel can occur even when Geller fields function properly if the vessel passes through regions where the barrier between real space and the Imperium grows thin. The Geller field creates a bubble of real space, but this bubble exists within the warp itself during transit, and sufficiently powerful demonic entities can sometimes breach the field through focused effort. These breaches typically begin small, with minor demons manifesting in isolated compartments where the field's influence weakens. The crew might initially mistake these manifestations for hallucinations or equipment malfunctions, allowing the incursion to spread before they recognize the true threat. Once demons establish presence aboard a vessel, eliminating them requires extensive combat that might rage through the ship's corridors for days or weeks of subjective time while the vessel remains in the warp. The temporal distortions associated with warp travel create situations that defy normal causality and challenge human understanding of time itself. The warp exists outside normal space-time, its nature such that duration and sequence prove fluid rather than fixed. A vessel might spend what its crew experiences as 2 weeks in warp transit, only to emerge into real space and discover that 6 months have passed in the outside universe. Alternatively, a vessel might experience months of subjective time during transit and emerge to find that only days have passed externally. These discrepancies complicate logistics and military planning, as vessels cannot reliably coordinate their arrivals even when departing simultaneously and following the same route. The most disturbing temporal anomalies involve vessels that arrive at their destinations before they departed, their emergence into real space occurring weeks or months prior to when they entered the warp. These incidents violate causality in ways that tech priests and navigators cannot explain, though they occur with enough frequency that experienced void crews accept them as another hazard of warp travel. The practical implications include situations where vessels receive distress calls from themselves, or where military forces arrive to reinforce positions before the battles that necessitated their deployment have occurred. Navy doctrine treats these temporal paradoxes as classified information, as the implications threaten the philosophical foundations on which the Imperium bases its understanding of reality. The opposite extreme proves equally devastating when vessels emerge from warp transit centuries after their expected arrival. The crews of these vessels experience normal subjective time during their journey, perhaps a few weeks or months of transit, but emerge into a galaxy that has moved on without them. The worlds they intended to visit might have fallen to enemy invasion or been destroyed entirely. The military campaigns they meant to reinforce concluded decades or centuries ago. The crew members' families aged and died, while the vessel remained lost in the warp. Some of these time-lost vessels integrate back into Imperial service, their crews accepting that they must adapt to a changed galaxy. Others find the temporal displacement too traumatic, their crews descending into madness or rebellion when confronted with the reality that everyone they knew is long dead. The lost fleets consumed by the warp represent a constant drain on Imperial naval strength that continues across millennia without resolution. Every year, dozens or hundreds of vessels enter the warp and never emerge, their fates unknown and their crews presumed dead. Some of these losses result from navigation errors that send vessels into regions of the warp so turbulent that no ship could survive passage. Others fall victim to Geller field failures or demonic incursion that destroys the vessel during transit. Still others simply vanish, their disappearances offering no clues about what befell them. The cumulative effect of these losses means that the Imperium must constantly construct new vessels to replace those that disappear, a burden that strains shipyard capacity and diverts resources from fleet expansion. The psychological toll of warp travel affects even experienced crews who make dozens or hundreds of successful transits. The knowledge that every journey through the Imperium risks catastrophic failure creates constant low-level stress that manifests in various ways. Some crew members develop obsessive rituals they perform before each warp transit, their superstitions providing psychological comfort even if they offer no actual protection. Others turn to faith, their prayers to the Emperor serving similar purposes. The most affected develop phobias about warp travel that can render them unable to function during transit, their fear overwhelming rational thought. Navy regulations require regular psychological screening for crew members, with those showing signs of serious warp-related trauma reassigned to system defense vessels that never enter the Imperium. The Gothic War stands as one of the most catastrophic naval conflicts in Imperial history, its campaigns demonstrating both the strategic importance of concentrated fleet power and the devastating consequences when ancient weapons fall into enemy hands. The war began in the year 139 of the 41st millennium, when Abaddon, the despoiler, launched his 12th Black Crusade from the Eye of Terror, his forces striking into the Gothic sector, with objectives that initially seemed limited to typical raiding operations. The Chaos fleets that emerged from the warp included capital ships dating from the Horus Heresy, alongside more recent vessels corrupted during previous Black Crusades, their combined strength representing one of the largest Chaos armadas assembled since the Siege of Terra. Lord Admiral Cornelius Ravensburg commanded Battle Fleet Gothic from his flagship, the Emperor-class battleship Lord of Light, his forces initially numbering approximately 40 capital ships and cruisers, along with supporting escort squadrons distributed across the sector's key systems. The opening phases of the Gothic War followed patterns familiar from previous Chaos incursions, with enemy fleets striking at isolated Imperial positions and withdrawing before concentrated Imperial forces could engage them. Ravensburg deployed his battle fleet in defensive formations, protecting the sector's forge worlds and major naval bases, his strategy emphasizing the protection of critical infrastructure over pursuing enemy raiders into regions where they held tactical advantage. This defensive posture proved sound until intelligence reports revealed Abaddon's true objective: the Blackstone fortresses, ancient space stations of unknown origin that drifted through the Gothic sector. These massive structures measured dozens of kilometers across and mounted weapon systems that exceeded anything in the Imperial or Chaos arsenals. Previous investigations by the Adeptus Mechanicus had failed to unlock the fortress's full capabilities, though tech priests understood that the stations possessed some form of planet-killing weaponry. Abaddon's forces moved against the Blackstone fortresses systematically, capturing 3 of the 6 stations before Imperial forces recognized the pattern and moved to secure the remainder. The Chaos fleets deployed specialized boarding forces that overwhelmed the minimal Imperial garrisons on the fortresses, their speed suggesting that Abaddon possessed intelligence about the station's locations and defenses that Imperial forces lacked. The capture of even a single Blackstone fortress would have represented a strategic disaster, as the station's firepower could devastate Imperial fleet formations or reduce defended worlds to lifeless rocks. 3 fortresses in Chaos hands created a situation that threatened not just the Gothic sector, but potentially the entire segmentum obscurus. Ravensburg's response demonstrated both tactical flexibility and willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. He divided Battle Fleet Gothic into multiple task forces, each assigned to either defend the remaining Imperial-held fortresses or conduct offensive operations against Chaos positions. The task force, commanded by Admiral Cornelius himself, moved to engage Chaos fleets besieging the fortress designated Blackstone 4, his battleships and cruisers pushing through enemy screening forces to establish orbital superiority around the station. The battle for Blackstone 4 lasted 3 weeks of continuous void combat, with Imperial and Chaos fleets exchanging broadsides at ranges that turned the space around the fortress into a debris field of wrecked escorts and damaged capital ships. Ravensburg's flagship suffered severe damage during the engagement, its port weapons batteries destroyed and void shields failing, but the Lord Admiral refused to withdraw until Imperial forces secured the fortress. The strategic situation deteriorated further when Abaddon activated the captured Blackstone fortress's primary weapons, their beams striking at Imperial positions across the sector. The fortress designated Blackstone 1 targeted the forge world of Stranavar, its beam punching through the planet's crust and triggering tectonic disruptions that devastated the world's industrial capacity. Billions died in the initial strike and subsequent earthquakes, while the forge world's orbital shipyards suffered catastrophic damage from debris thrown into orbit by the attack. The loss of Stranavar's manufacturing capability represented a strategic blow that would affect Imperial naval operations throughout Segmentum Obscurus for decades, as the Forge world had produced a significant percentage of the region's macro cannon shells and armor plate. The Mechanicus response to the Blackstone crisis involved deploying specialized tech priest teams to the Imperial-held fortresses, their mission to unlock the station's capabilities before Chaos forces could leverage their captured fortresses to achieve complete dominance. These investigations proceeded under combat conditions, with Chaos fleets conducting repeated attacks against the Imperial-held stations, while tech priests worked to penetrate security systems that had resisted analysis for millennia. The breakthrough came when Archmagos Corvus Vale discovered that the fortresses responded to psychic commands, their control systems designed to interface with psychers rather than conventional crew. This discovery allowed the Mechanicus to activate the Imperial fortress's weapons, creating a strategic balance where both sides possessed planet-killing capability, but neither could achieve decisive advantage without risking mutual destruction. The naval campaigns that followed involved fleet actions of unprecedented scale, as both Imperial and Chaos forces maneuvered to protect their fortresses while seeking opportunities to destroy enemy stations. The Battle of Gethsemane saw Battlefleet Gothic engage a Chaos armada that included the Planet Killer, Abaddon's flagship mounting a weapon that had already destroyed multiple Imperial worlds during previous Black Crusades. Ravensburg's tactical approach involved using the Imperial-held Blackstone fortresses as mobile weapons platforms, their beams targeting Chaos capital ships at ranges where conventional fleet weapons proved ineffective. The engagement demonstrated the fortress's devastating anti-ship capabilities when Blackstone 4's beam struck a Chaos battleship, the focused energy punching through void shields and armor to detonate the vessel's plasma reactors in an explosion visible from neighboring systems. The turning point of the Gothic War came when Imperial forces managed to destroy 2 of the Chaos-held Blackstone fortresses through coordinated fleet actions that overwhelmed the station's defenses. The destruction of Blackstone 2 required a task force of 6 battleships and supporting cruisers to concentrate fire on the fortress's power generation systems, their sustained bombardment eventually triggering cascading failures that tore the station apart from within. The loss of these fortresses shifted the strategic balance decisively in the Imperium's favor, as Abaddon's remaining fortress could not achieve the dominance that 3 stations had provided. The despoiler's response involved withdrawing his fleet to the Eye of Terror, though not before deploying the Planet Killer against the world of Savaven, its weapon reducing the Hive world to fragments in an attack that killed 17 billion people. Ravensburg's defense of the Gothic sector cost Battlefleet Gothic approximately 60% of its pre-war strength, with 24 capital ships and cruisers destroyed or damaged beyond practical repair. The Lord Admiral himself survived the war despite his flagship suffering catastrophic damage in multiple engagements, his leadership throughout the conflict earning him recognition as one of the Imperium's most capable fleet commanders. The strategic lessons from the Gothic War influenced Imperial naval doctrine for subsequent decades, particularly regarding the concentration of fleet strength and the importance of maintaining strategic reserves capable of responding to unexpected threats. The war also demonstrated the vulnerability of Imperial positions to attacks by ancient weapons whose capabilities exceeded current Imperial technology, a lesson that proved prophetic given subsequent events. The fall of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade represented the culmination of Abaddon's 10,000-year campaign against the Imperium, his forces finally achieving what 12 previous Black Crusades had failed to accomplish. Battlefleet Cadia, one of the most heavily reinforced naval formations in the Imperium, maintained constant vigil over the Cadian Gate, the stable warp route connecting the Eye of Terror to the broader Imperium. The fleet's strength included dozens of capital ships and cruisers, along with hundreds of escorts, their deployments coordinated to maintain coverage over the multiple systems that formed the defensive network protecting the gate. Lord Admiral Quarren commanded the fleet from his flagship, the Retribution-class battleship Flame of Purity, his strategic approach emphasizing forward defense that engaged Chaos forces as they emerged from the Eye, rather than allowing them to penetrate deeper into Imperial space. The opening of the 13th Black Crusade saw Chaos fleets emerging from the Eye in numbers that exceeded anything previous incursions had deployed. The initial waves included hundreds of vessels ranging from escorts to capital ships, their coordinated emergence suggesting planning and resource accumulation that had occurred over decades or centuries within the Eye's time-dilated interior. Battlefleet Cadia engaged these forces across multiple systems simultaneously, the fleet's distributed deployment allowing it to contest Chaos advances at numerous points, but preventing concentration of Imperial strength against priority targets. The naval battles that erupted across the Cadian Gate region involved fleet actions, where dozens of capital ships exchanged fire, while escort squadrons conducted running battles that lasted weeks as both sides maneuvered for advantage. The strategic situation deteriorated when Abaddon deployed the remaining Blackstone fortress from the Gothic War, its presence forcing Imperial fleets to disperse rather than concentrate against Chaos positions. The fortress's planet killing beam had already destroyed multiple worlds during its journey from the Gothic sector, and its arrival in the Cadian system created a threat that Imperial forces struggled to counter. Battlefleet Cadia attempted multiple attacks against the fortress, their capital ships conducting coordinated strikes that sought to overwhelm the station's defenses through concentrated firepower. These attacks achieved limited success, with Imperial forces managing to damage the fortress's weapon systems, but failing to destroy it outright before Chaos escorts and capital ships intervened to drive off the attackers. The destruction of Cadia itself resulted from Abaddon ramming the Blackstone fortress into the planet after Imperial forces disabled the station's primary weapon. The impact triggered tectonic collapse that tore the world apart over a period of hours, its fragmentation creating a debris field that would render the system hazardous to navigation for millennia. The loss of Cadia represented more than just the destruction of a single world. The planet's position had anchored the defensive network that protected the Cadian Gate, and its destruction allowed Chaos forces to pour through the gate in numbers that Imperial forces could not contain. The pylons that had stood on Cadia's surface for unknown millennia, their function involving some form of warp stabilization, ceased functioning when the planet broke apart, their destruction contributing to the catastrophic warp storms that would shortly tear across the galaxy. Battlefleet Cadia suffered catastrophic losses during the fall, with approximately 70% of its strength destroyed or rendered combat ineffective by the campaign's conclusion. Lord Admiral Quarren died when his flagship suffered catastrophic damage during the final defense of Cadia itself, the Flame of Purity's destruction taking with it most of Battlefleet Cadia's senior command staff. The surviving vessels withdrew to secondary positions throughout the sector, their scattered deployments reflecting the complete collapse of the organized defensive network that had protected the region for 10,000 years. The opening of the Great Rift shortly after Cadia's fall created additional chaos as warp storms erupted across the galaxy, their violence rendering many established warp routes impassable and isolating Imperial forces throughout Segmentum Obscurus. The formation of new battle fleets in the wake of the Great Rift's opening required unprecedented mobilization of Imperial naval resources from across the Imperium. The High Lords of Terra authorized the creation of multiple new battle fleet commands to replace the strength lost at Cadia and to establish defensive networks in regions that the Rift had cut off from central command. Battlefleet Obscurus received massive reinforcements drawn from reserve fleets and shipyard production across multiple Forge worlds. Its strength rebuilt to levels approaching pre-fall capabilities, though the quality of hastily constructed replacement vessels often fell short of the veteran ships they replaced. The strategic situation in Imperium Nihilus required the establishment of entirely new fleet commands operating with minimal support from Terra, their forces cobbled together from surviving vessels, and whatever reinforcements managed to cross the gauntlet before warp conditions rendered the passage temporarily impassable. The Macharian Crusade represents the largest sustained Imperial military campaign since the Great Crusade itself, its scope encompassing the conquest of nearly 1,000 worlds across a front that stretched thousands of light years. Lord Commander Solar Macharius launched the crusade in the year 392 of the 41st millennium. His forces, including dozens of Imperial Guard armies supported by Navy assets that Lord Admiral Titius assembled into the largest fleet concentration in recent Imperial history. The fleet that supported the Macharian Crusade included over 200 capital ships and cruisers along with thousands of escorts, their strength drawn from multiple segmentum battle fleets and supplemented by vessels from Forge World Defense Forces and even some rogue trader vessels whose captains saw opportunity in supporting such a massive military operation. Titius commanded this armada from the Apocalypse-class battleship Lord of Ages, his flagship serving as mobile command center for naval operations that spanned multiple sectors simultaneously. The Admiral's strategic approach emphasized maintaining secure supply lines between the Crusade's forward positions and Imperial space, his understanding that the Crusade's success depended as much on logistics as on tactical victories. The fleet's composition reflected this priority, with approximately 40% of its strength consisting of transport vessels, supply ships, and tankers rather than combat warships. These logistics vessels carried the ammunition, fuel, rations, and equipment that kept Macharius's armies advancing, their cargoes representing the lifeblood of the Crusade. The 7-year duration of the Macharian Crusade tested Imperial logistics capabilities to their limits. The fleet consumed supplies at rates that required constant resupply from Forge worlds and agri-worlds across multiple sectors. The volume of materiel involved exceeding anything Imperial planners had attempted since the Great Crusade. Ammunition expenditure alone required the output of dozens of Forge worlds working at maximum capacity, their production dedicated to maintaining the Crusade's advance rather than supplying other Imperial forces. The fuel requirements for the fleet's plasma reactors and the Guard's vehicle pools necessitated establishing supply depots at conquered worlds along the Crusade's route, these forward bases serving as staging points where vessels could refuel and rearm before continuing to the front lines. The naval campaigns that supported Macharius's ground operations involved establishing orbital superiority over target worlds before conducting planetary assaults, a pattern that repeated hundreds of times across the Crusade's 7-year span. Titius developed standardized procedures for these operations that emphasized speed and efficiency over the methodical approaches that characterized earlier Imperial campaigns. A typical planetary assault began with scout vessels conducting auger sweeps to identify orbital defenses and enemy fleet elements, their reconnaissance providing targeting data for the main fleet's approach. The battle line then advanced, its capital ships engaging enemy orbital fortresses and defense platforms, while cruiser squadrons dealt with hostile fleet elements. Once orbital superiority was established, the fleet transitioned to bombardment operations that suppressed ground defenses and provided fire support for Guard landings. The logistical challenges of maintaining this operational tempo across 7 years required innovations in fleet organization and supply chain management that influenced imperial naval doctrine for decades afterward. Titius organized the fleet into semi-independent task forces, each assigned to support specific guard armies, and granted considerable autonomy in tactical decision-making. This decentralized command structure allowed the Crusade to conduct operations across multiple systems simultaneously without requiring constant communication with the fleet's central command, a necessity given the warp communication delays that affected coordination across such vast distances. Each task force included its own logistics train and repair vessels, creating self-sufficient formations capable of sustained operations without constant resupply from central depots. The Crusade's eventual conclusion came not from military defeat, but from Macharius's death and the subsequent collapse of unified command. The Lord Commander died of unknown causes, his passing triggering disputes among his subordinates about who should assume overall command. The fleet that Titius had assembled began fragmenting as individual admirals and guard commanders pursued their own objectives or withdrew to consolidate gains in regions they considered strategically important. Titius himself attempted to maintain fleet cohesion, but without Macharius's authority to enforce cooperation between different imperial commanders, the unified crusade dissolved into dozens of smaller campaigns. The admiral eventually withdrew the core fleet elements back to imperial space, leaving garrison forces and reduced naval squadrons to hold the conquered territories. The Tyranid Hive fleet encounters represent a fundamentally different category of naval warfare than conflicts against chaos or other conventional enemies. The first major engagement between Imperial naval forces and Tyranid bioships occurred when Hive fleet Behemoth entered the galaxy, its massive swarm of organisms approaching the eastern fringe on a trajectory that would take it through multiple inhabited systems. Battlefleet Tempestus, commanded by Lord Admiral Wrath, deployed to intercept the Hive fleet based on intelligence gathered by explorator vessels that had encountered the Vanguard organisms. The initial augur readings suggested a fleet of conventional vessels, though the strange organic signatures puzzled Imperial observers who expected to detect plasma drives and metal hulls rather than biological energy patterns. The Battle of Tyran Prime demonstrated the horrifying reality of Tyranid bioship capabilities when Battlefleet Tempestus engaged the Hive fleet's Vanguard elements. The bioships proved unlike any enemy vessels Imperial forces had previously encountered, their living hulls capable of regenerating damage that would cripple conventional warships, and their weapons launching organisms rather than shells or energy beams. The smaller bioships swarmed Imperial escorts, their numbers allowing them to overwhelm individual vessels through coordinated attacks that conventional tactics struggled to counter. The larger bioships, some measuring kilometers in length, engaged Imperial capital ships with weapons that fired corrosive organisms capable of eating through armor and void shields, their attacks causing damage that spread through affected vessels like infections. The tactical challenges of fighting Tyranid bioships forced Imperial commanders to adapt their doctrine rapidly or face annihilation. Conventional broadside exchanges proved ineffective against swarm tactics, where dozens of smaller bioships attacked simultaneously from multiple vectors, their coordination suggesting hive mind control that allowed them to operate as a unified organism rather than individual vessels. Imperial escort squadrons found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers, their weapons batteries unable to eliminate enough bioships to prevent the swarm from closing to boarding range. Once bioships made contact with Imperial vessels, they deployed boarding organisms that proved even more horrifying than conventional boarding actions, the Tyranid creatures consuming crew members and ship systems indiscriminately as they spread through the vessel. Lord Admiral Wrath's tactical response involved concentrating his capital ships into tight formations, where their overlapping fields of fire could create kill zones that bioships had to cross to reach Imperial vessels. This defensive approach sacrificed mobility for firepower concentration, with battleships and cruisers forming walls of battle that engaged approaching bioships at maximum range. The strategy achieved some success, with massed lance fire and macro cannon batteries destroying bioships in sufficient numbers to blunt some attacks. However, the Tyrannid swarm proved willing to accept casualties that would break conventional enemy fleets, their bioships continuing to advance despite losses that exceeded 50% of attacking forces. The hive mind calculated that even heavy losses proved acceptable if enough bioships survived to overwhelm Imperial defenses and begin consuming the biomass of targeted worlds. The Eastern Fringe battles against Hive Fleet Kraken demonstrated that the Imperium had learned little from Behemoth's initial invasion, as Kraken's arrival in 992 found Imperial naval forces still struggling to develop effective counter-tactics against bioship swarms. Kraken approached the Eastern Fringe along multiple vectors simultaneously, its fleet elements dispersed across a front spanning dozens of systems. This strategic approach prevented Imperial forces from concentrating against a single thrust, forcing Battle Fleet Tempestus and supporting naval elements to divide their strength to cover multiple threatened regions. The battles that erupted across the Eastern Fringe involved fleet actions, where Imperial capital ships found themselves engaged against bioship swarms that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude. The desperate void battles against Hive Fleet Leviathan in the early 42nd millennium revealed that Tyrannid bioship evolution had produced organisms specifically adapted to counter Imperial naval tactics. The bioships encountered during Leviathan's invasion included new organisms that demonstrated capabilities not observed in previous Hive fleets. Some bioships generated electromagnetic pulses that disrupted Imperial auger arrays and targeting systems, their attacks blinding Imperial vessels and forcing gun crews to engage targets visually at ranges where visual observation proved nearly useless. Other bioships deployed clouds of spore organisms that interfered with lance beams and macro cannon shells, their defensive screens absorbing firepower that would otherwise strike the larger bioships they protected. The numerical superiority that Leviathan deployed overwhelmed Imperial defenses through sheer mass rather than tactical sophistication. Imperial fleet commanders reported engagement where their auger arrays detected hundreds of bioship contacts approaching simultaneously, the swarm's density such that destroying individual bioships made no appreciable difference to the overall threat. The battles devolved into attritional warfare, where Imperial vessels fired continuously until their ammunition stores depleted or their weapons batteries overheated and failed. Even when Imperial forces achieved local tactical victories by destroying attacking bioships, strategic defeat followed as subsequent waves arrived to replace losses faster than Imperial shipyards could replace destroyed vessels. The Tyrannid approach to void warfare proved fundamentally different from any enemy the Imperium had previously faced. Their willingness to accept unlimited casualties in pursuit of objectives, creating situations where conventional military calculations about acceptable loss rates became meaningless. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum in the closing years of the 41st millennium represented the most catastrophic disruption to Imperial naval operations since the Horus Heresy itself. The Great Rift tore across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly in the galactic south, creating a barrier of warp storms so violent that conventional navigation through the affected regions became functionally impossible for most vessels. The immediate impact on Imperial fleet operations proved devastating as established warp routes that had carried traffic for millennia simply ceased to exist, their stable currents overwhelmed by the chaotic energies pouring from the rift. Navigators attempting to chart courses through or near the rift reported experiences that drove some to madness, their third eyes perceiving warp phenomena of such intensity that their minds could not process the information without suffering permanent damage. The strategic consequences manifested within weeks as communication between Terra and regions beyond the rift degraded to sporadic contact at best and complete silence at worst. Astropathic messages that normally crossed the galaxy in days or weeks now took months to arrive if they arrived at all, their psychic signals distorted or blocked entirely by the rift's interference with the immaterium. Naval commands on both sides of the divide found themselves operating without orders from higher authority, their Lord Admirals forced to make strategic decisions that would normally require approval from Segmentum Command or even the High Lords of Terra. Battlefleet Ultima, stationed in regions that fell into what would become known as Imperium Nihilus, lost contact with Mars and Terra almost immediately, its commanders receiving their last coherent orders in the weeks before the rift's opening, and nothing but garbled fragments afterward. The severance of warp routes affected not just military coordination, but the fundamental logistics that kept Imperial naval forces operational. Forge worlds on the Terra side of the rift had supplied ships, ammunition, and replacement parts to fleets operating in what became Nihilus for thousands of years, their production integrated into supply chains that assumed reliable warp travel between manufacturing centers and fleet bases. The sudden impossibility of maintaining these supply lines meant that fleets in Nihilus faced equipment shortages within months, their stores of macro cannon shells, torpedo warheads, and replacement components depleting without possibility of resupply from traditional sources. Shipyards in Nihilus that had relied on raw materials and specialized components from Mars found themselves unable to complete vessels already under construction, their half-finished hulls sitting in orbital berths, while tech priests searched desperately for alternative suppliers. The Astronomican's light, which had guided navigators for 10,000 years, became unreliable or completely invisible to navigators operating in Imperium Nihilus. Those navigators who ventured into the deeper regions of Nihilus reported that the beacon appeared dimmed to the point of uselessness, its light blocked or distorted by the rift's overwhelming presence in the warp. Some regions experienced complete blackout where no trace of the Astronomican could be detected, forcing navigators to attempt blind jumps or rely on local stellar phenomena for navigation reference points. The navigator houses lost dozens of their members in the months following the rift's opening, their deaths occurring when vessels became lost in the warp or emerged into real space thousands of light years from their intended destinations in regions where no Imperial presence existed to provide assistance. Robute Guilliman's return to the Imperium and his subsequent launch of the Indomitus Crusade represented the Imperium's first organized response to the catastrophe that the Great Rift had created. The Primarch assumed command of military forces that included elements from across the Imperium, his authority as Lord Commander of the Imperium superseding normal chains of command, and allowing him to coordinate Navy, Guard, and Space Marine assets in ways that the fractured Imperial command structure typically prevented. The fleet assets that Guilliman assembled for the Indomitus Crusade included substantial elements of Battlefleet Solar, the most powerful naval force in the Imperium, along with vessels drawn from Forge World defense fleets and even some ships from rogue trader dynasties whose warrants Guilliman invoked to compel their participation. The Unnumbered Sons, Space Marines from various chapters who had been organized into mixed formations during the Terran Crusade that preceded Guilliman's broader campaign, brought their own fleet assets to the Indomitus Crusade. These strike cruisers and battle barges operated under direct Primarch authority rather than answering to their parent chapters, creating an ad hoc Space Marine fleet that numbered dozens of vessels. The torchbearer fleets that accompanied the Crusade carried the Primaris Space Marines and their equipment, their vessels including specialized transports designed to deliver these reinforcements to chapters across the galaxy. These torchbearer ships incorporated technologies that Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call had developed during his 10,000-year project to create the Primaris Marines, their systems including improved Geller field generators and auger arrays that performed better in the disrupted warp conditions that now characterized much of the galaxy. The Indomitus Crusade's naval operations involved pushing through the Nachmund Gauntlet, the narrow passage through the Great Rift that represented the only reliable route between Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. The Gauntlet's approaches on both sides became sites of intense naval warfare, as Chaos forces recognized the strategic importance of this passage and deployed substantial fleet assets to contest Imperial control. The battles fought in the systems flanking the gauntlet-involved fleet actions, where Imperial capital ships engaged Chaos vessels that emerged from the rift itself, their hulls bearing the marks of millennia spent within the Eye of Terror or other warp storm regions. The Imperial Navy's tactical approach emphasized establishing and maintaining control over the Gauntlet's endpoints, their defensive networks incorporating orbital fortresses, minefields, and patrol squadrons that screened for Chaos incursions. Guilliman's fleet crossed the Gauntlet in force during the early phases of the Indomitus Crusade, the Primarch's presence aboard the flagship Macraga's Honor providing both strategic direction and symbolic importance to the operation. The crossing itself proved hazardous despite the Gauntlet, representing the most stable passage through the rift, with vessels experiencing warp phenomena that tested even the improved Gellar fields that Call's technology provided. Several ships in the Crusade fleet suffered catastrophic Gellar field failures during the crossing, their loss representing acceptable casualties in Guilliman's strategic calculus, but devastating to the crews and passengers aboard those vessels. The survivors emerged into Imperium Nihilus to find a region of space where Imperial authority had collapsed or fragmented across thousands of worlds, their populations isolated from Terra and facing threats ranging from xenos invasions to Chaos incursions, without hope of reinforcement from the broader Imperium. The adaptation strategies that Imperial naval forces developed for operating in Imperium Nihilus reflected the fundamental changes that the Great Rift imposed on void warfare and fleet operations. The most immediate adaptation involved shifting from the long-range warp jumps that had characterized Imperial naval movement to much shorter transits that covered only a few light years at a time. Navigators operating in Nihilus reported that these shorter jumps proved more survivable than attempting longer transits, as the reduced time in the warp decreased exposure to the violent currents and demonic attention that longer voyages attracted. A journey that might have taken 2 weeks of subjective warp time before the rift's opening now required multiple shorter jumps over a period of months, with vessels translating back into real space between each jump to allow navigators to rest and recalculate their courses. The reliance on secondary warp beacons became essential for navigation in regions where the Astronomican proved invisible or unreliable. Some of these beacons existed as ancient installations dating back to the Dark Age of technology, their functions poorly understood, but their psychic signatures strong enough that navigators could use them as reference points for local navigation. Other beacons represented new construction, with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica deploying specialized teams to establish psychic lighthouse stations at strategic locations throughout Nihilus. These installations required constant maintenance by choirs of sanctioned psychers, whose lives burned out rapidly under the strain of projecting psychic signals strong enough for navigators to detect across multiple systems. The mortality rate among psychers assigned to these beacon stations exceeded even the horrific casualty rates that characterized service in the Astronomican choir, with most psychers surviving only weeks or months before their souls exhausted completely. Navigator casualties increased dramatically across Imperium Nihilus as the strain of navigating without the Astronomican's guidance took its toll on even experienced members of the Navis Nobilite. The Navigator houses reported losing more of their members in the first 5 years after the rift's opening than they had lost in the previous century, their deaths occurring through various mechanisms that all stemmed from excessive exposure to the warp's unfiltered chaos. Some navigators suffered catastrophic psychic trauma when their third eyes perceived phenomena that their minds could not process, their sanity shattering under the strain of witnessing the warp's reality without the Astronomican's light to provide reference and stability. Others experienced physical deterioration as their bodies failed under the stress of maintaining constant vigilance during extended voyages, their immune systems collapsing or their organs failing from exhaustion. The desperate measures that isolated battle fleets adopted to maintain operations ranged from practical adaptations to actions that bordered on tech heresy or worse. Some fleet commanders authorized their tech priests to implement modifications to ship systems that deviated from approved STC patterns, their desperation overriding the normal prohibition against such changes. These modifications included enhanced Geller field generators that drew additional power from plasma reactors at the cost of reduced weapons capacity, or auger arrays modified to detect warp phenomena that standard systems could not register. The Mechanicus tech priests who implemented these changes did so with full knowledge that they risked charges of tech heresy, but the alternative of watching their fleets become non-functional due to equipment failures proved unacceptable. Other fleets resorted to pressing captured enemy vessels into Imperial service, their crews stripping chaos corruption from hulls and reconsecrating them to the Emperor before deploying them alongside conventional Imperial ships. This practice violated numerous regulations and invited accusations of heresy, as the taint that permeated chaos vessels proved difficult or impossible to cleanse completely. Fleet commanders who authorized these conversions argued that the strategic necessity of maintaining operational strength justified the risks, though inquisitors investigating these cases often disagreed and ordered the destruction of converted vessels, along with the execution of officers who had authorized their use. The practice continued nonetheless, as isolated fleet commanders recognized that maintaining combat capability took precedence over regulatory compliance when their forces stood as the only Imperial presence in entire sectors. The rise of independent naval powers in the Dark Imperium occurred as sectors cut off from Terra developed their own defensive capabilities without central coordination or support. Planetary governors and sector lords who found themselves isolated from Imperial authority recognized that their survival depended on maintaining military forces capable of defending against threats that would previously have been met by Navy battle fleets or guard armies deployed from other regions. Some sectors possessed sufficient local shipyard capacity to begin constructing their own vessels, their tech priests working from whatever STC fragments and technical documentation they could access to produce ships that approximated standard Imperial patterns. The quality of these locally constructed vessels varied dramatically, with some sectors producing ships that met or exceeded Navy standards, while others launched vessels that barely qualified as void-worthy. The Nachmund Gauntlet's strategic importance meant that control over this passage determined which regions of Imperium Nihilus could receive reinforcement from Sanctus, and which remained completely isolated. Both Imperial and enemy forces recognized this reality, leading to the establishment of permanent military presences on both sides of the gauntlet. The Imperial Navy deployed substantial fleet assets to garrison the gauntlet's approaches, their forces including multiple battleship squadrons and dozens of cruiser-weight vessels, along with hundreds of escorts. These garrison fleets operated under orders to maintain the passage at all costs, their commanders authorized to accept any casualties necessary to prevent enemy forces from closing the gauntlet or establishing positions that could interdict Imperial traffic. The sectors forced to maintain their own defenses developed organizational structures that often diverged significantly from standard Imperial military practice. Without access to the Adeptus Munitorum's logistical networks or the Navy's centralized command hierarchy, local commanders created hybrid forces that combined elements of Navy, Guard, and even Space Marine doctrine into whatever organizational models proved effective for their specific circumstances. Some sectors established unified military commands, where a single authority controlled both void-going and ground forces, essentially recreating the integrated Imperial Army structure that had existed before the Horus Heresy reforms separated Navy and Guard. These unified commands proved more effective at coordinating combined arms operations than the fractured command structures that characterized conventional Imperial military organization, though they also concentrated power in ways that the post-heresy reforms had specifically intended to prevent. The maintenance of local shipyards without Martian oversight created situations where forge worlds in Imperium Nihilus operated with unprecedented independence from the Mechanicus hierarchy. These Forge worlds continued producing ships and equipment according to STC patterns they possessed, but without regular contact with Mars, they lacked access to the technical guidance and quality control that the Fabricator General's authority normally provided. Some Forge worlds maintained standards that matched or exceeded those enforced by Mars, their tech priests adhering to orthodox practices through institutional momentum and genuine devotion to the machine god. Other Forge worlds drifted toward heterodox practices, as local magi made pragmatic decisions about modifying patterns or implementing innovations that Mars would have forbidden, their isolation from central authority allowing them to experiment in ways that would have resulted in charges of tech heresy under normal circumstances. The strategic situation in Imperium Nihilus by the mid-42nd millennium had stabilized into a pattern where the Imperium maintained control over some regions, while others remained contested or had fallen entirely to enemy control. The Indomitus Crusades' progress through Nihilus established Imperial presence in key sectors, with Guilliman's forces liberating worlds and reinforcing isolated Imperial positions before moving on to subsequent objectives. The Crusades left behind garrison forces and reconstituted planetary defense forces, their strength sufficient to maintain local security, but inadequate to project power beyond their immediate regions. The broader pattern that emerged saw the Imperium controlling a network of fortified systems connected by the few warp routes that remained passable, while vast regions between these strongpoints remained effectively outside Imperial authority. The long-term implications of the Great Rift's division of the Imperium extend far beyond immediate military concerns. The isolation of Imperium Nihilus from Terra means that regions comprising perhaps a third of the Imperium's territory and population now operate with minimal connection to the central authority that had governed them for 10,000 years. Some sectors in Nihilus maintain nominal loyalty to the Emperor and Terra despite their isolation, their populations continuing to pay tithes and follow Imperial law even though no central authority exists to enforce compliance. Other regions have drifted toward independence, their rulers recognizing that practical sovereignty now rests with whoever controls local military forces rather than with distant Terra. The Imperium that will eventually emerge from this crisis, assuming the rift ever closes or becomes passable through conventional means, will likely prove fundamentally different from the Imperium that existed before, its structure adapted to the reality of permanent or semi-permanent division between Sanctus and Nihilus. The naval forces operating in Imperium Nihilus face threats that differ in character from those encountered in Sanctus, as the region's isolation from the Astronomican and proximity to the Great Rift creates conditions where chaos incursions occur with greater frequency and intensity. Demon ships emerge from the rift itself to raid Imperial positions, their hulls incorporating impossible geometries and mounting weapons that violate physical laws. Imperial vessels engaging these demon ships report experiences that test crew sanity, as conventional void warfare doctrine proves inadequate against enemies whose vessels regenerate damage through warp-spawned energies or phase in and out of real space to avoid incoming fire. The fleet commanders who operate in these regions develop specialized tactics for engaging demonic threats, their approaches emphasizing rapid engagement and overwhelming firepower delivered before demon ships can fully manifest their capabilities. The Imperium's naval power projection capabilities across the entire galaxy have been fundamentally and perhaps permanently diminished by the Great Rift's opening. The fleets that once moved freely between segmentums now face barriers that prevent or severely restrict their movement, their strategic flexibility reduced to operating within either Sanctus or Nihilus rather than across the galaxy as a whole. The long-term survival of the Imperium depends on adapting to this new reality, with naval forces in both regions developing capabilities for independent operation without relying on reinforcement or resupply from across the rift. Whether this adaptation preserves the Imperium as a unified political entity or merely delays its fragmentation into separate successor states remains an open question that the next millennium will answer through blood and fire across a million worlds.